I wiped out my entire life savings, every last penny of $11,000, just to rent out an exclusive penthouse restaurant in downtown Chicago. It was a desperate, massive gamble to save my 5-year marriage to a man who had been slipping through my fingers for months. I truly believed I was planning the ultimate romantic surprise for Valentine's Day. But when I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to the rooftop, the surprise was entirely on me. My husband was not waiting for me with open arms or a smile. He was down on one knee in the center of a heart made of roses, proposing to his billionaire CEO. And the absolute worst part was that the velvet ring box he was holding had my initials stamped inside. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was brutal that night, but I barely felt the cold. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Spire, the most sought-after restaurant in the city, smoothing down the red silk dress I had bought specifically for this occasion. My heart was hammering against my ribs. $11,000. That was the exact cost to rent the private glass-enclosed rooftop for 2 hours. It was money I had saved dollar by dollar from my job as a junior accountant, working overtime, skipping lunches, doing extra tax returns on the weekends. I had drained the account to zero that morning. I walked through the revolving glass doors into the warm, dimly lit lobby. I was 15 minutes early. I wanted to make sure the champagne was chilled, the string quartet was in place, and the lighting was absolutely perfect before I texted David to come upstairs. He thought we were just meeting for a quick drink at the lobby bar. He had complained about coming at all, claiming he was exhausted from work. I approached the host stand with a nervous smile. A tall man in a pristine tuxedo looked up from his reservation screen. "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am Sarah Myers. I have the rooftop reserved for tonight." The maitre d' looked at me, then down at his screen, and his professional smile instantly vanished. A look of sheer panic washed over his face. He stepped out from behind the podium, physically placing himself between me and the private elevator. "I am so sorry, ma'am," he stammered, raising his hand slightly. "There must be some mistake. The rooftop is completely closed off to the public tonight. The VIP gentleman's private party is already underway." I frowned, confused. "No, you do not understand. I am the one who rented it. My name is on the contract. I paid the deposit months ago and the final balance this morning." The maitre d' shook his head, his eyes darting toward the security guard standing near the front doors. "Ma'am, please keep your voice down." The gentleman upstairs specifically instructed us that there were to be absolutely no interruptions. His private event started 20 minutes ago. "I cannot let you up there." My mind raced, trying to make sense of his panic. The VIP gentleman. David. Of course. David must have figured out my surprise. He always hated being out of the loop. He must have seen the charge on our joint credit card, or maybe he saw an email from the venue. He got here early. He hijacked my surprise to turn it around on me. A wave of relief and sudden overwhelming affection washed over me. He cared enough to get here early. He cared enough to take over the event. "It is my husband," I told the host, stepping forward and reaching for the elevator button. "He is surprising me. It is our anniversary week and Valentine's Day." "Ma'am, wait. You cannot go up there." The host reached out to grab my arm, but I slipped past him. I pressed the button for the penthouse. The doors slid open immediately. The host lunged forward, but I was already inside, hitting the button for the top floor. The doors closed on his panicked face. As the elevator shot upward, the smooth hum of the machinery was the only sound in the small space. I leaned against the mirrored wall, taking a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I closed my eyes and let the memories of the last few years wash over me. I needed this night to work. I needed us to go back to how we used to be. When David and I got married 5 years ago, we had absolutely nothing. He had just graduated with a degree in software engineering, carrying $80,000 in student loan debt. I was a junior accountant making a modest salary. We lived in a tiny, drafty apartment where the heating barely worked. But we had a plan. We had a partnership. Or at least I thought we did. For the entirety of my 20s, I worked 60-hour weeks to build our life. I took on every extra shift, every miserable weekend audit, every corporate tax filing I could get my hands on. Every spare dollar went straight to David's student loans. I drove a 10-year-old car with a failing transmission so he could lease a nice sedan for his interviews. I packed my lunches every day while he went out to networking dinners. I wanted him to succeed. I wanted him to climb the corporate ladder at his tech firm without the crushing weight of debt holding him back. And he did climb. 2 years ago, he landed a senior director role at a massive tech conglomerate. His salary tripled. I remember the night he got the job. We drank cheap wine on our living room floor, and he promised me that my days of sacrificing were over. He promised we would start taking vacations, that we would buy a house, that it was finally my turn to relax. But the exact opposite happened. The moment the last payment cleared on his student loans, David changed. He stopped coming home for dinner. The networking events turned into late-night strategy meetings that lasted until 2 a.m. He started buying expensive suits, designer watches, and bottles of cologne that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. When I asked him about the sudden spending, he would brush me off, telling me I just did not understand corporate tech culture. He said he had to look the part to get the next promotion. For the last 8 months, we had essentially been living as roommates. He was always on his phone, always texting, always distracted. When I tried to talk to him about our marriage, about the distance growing between us, he would gaslight me. He would tell me I was being needy, that I was suffocating his ambition, that he was working himself to the bone for our future, and I was just being ungrateful. I felt so guilty. I convinced myself that I was the problem. I convinced myself that the spark had died because I was too focused on budgets and spreadsheets while he was out conquering the world. That is why I drained my savings for this night. I wanted to show him that I could be spontaneous. I wanted to remind him of the girl he married, the girl who believed in him when nobody else did. The elevator chimed, pulling me out of my memories. The doors slid open to the penthouse vestibule. It was perfectly silent. There was a short hallway leading to the heavy mahogany doors that opened onto the rooftop terrace. I could see the soft glow of candlelight flickering against the glass. I smoothed my dress one last time, pasted a bright, loving smile on my face, and pushed the doors open. The cold Chicago air hit my face instantly. The rooftop was breathtaking. Thousands of fairy lights were strung across the glass canopy above. A string quartet was playing a soft classical melody in the corner. In the center of the terrace, overlooking the glittering city skyline, was a massive heart made entirely of deep red rose petals. Hundreds of thick pillar candles surrounded the floral arrangement. It was exactly what I had paid for. It was beautiful. Then I looked at the center of the heart. David was there. He was wearing his custom-tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled. But he was not looking at the doors. He was not looking for me. He was down on one knee. Standing directly in front of him, covering her mouth in a picture-perfect display of shock and joy, was Victoria. She was 45 years old, impeccably dressed in a designer evening gown, and she was the CEO of David's tech company. I knew her face from the corporate newsletters David used to leave on the kitchen counter. She was a billionaire heiress who had taken over her family's tech empire. I froze. My feet felt like they had been cemented to the floorboards. The breath left my lungs in a violent rush. The world around me completely stopped making sense. David held a small black velvet box open in his hands. The lighting caught the massive diamond resting inside, making it sparkle brilliantly against the dark fabric. Victoria, David was saying, his voice thick with emotion, a tone I had not heard him use with me in years. You have changed my entire world. You are my partner, my equal, my soulmate. I cannot imagine spending another day of my life without you by my side. Will you marry me? Victoria let out a breathless laugh, tears shining in her eyes. Yes, she said, her voice echoing across the rooftop. Oh my God, David! Yes, of course I will. David smiled a massive, triumphant smile. He reached into the box to take the ring out. That was when my eyes locked onto the velvet box in his hand. Even from 10 feet away, I recognized the worn edges of the black velvet. I recognized the slight tear in the fabric near the hinge. It was my box. Inside the lid, stamped in faded gold lettering, were my initials. It was the box that held my late grandmother's 2-carat vintage diamond ring. The exact same ring I had handed to David 2 weeks ago to put into our bank safe deposit box because the clasp was feeling loose and I wanted to get it repaired. He did not put it in the bank. He stole my grandmother's ring, and he was giving it to his CEO. I stood there in the freezing wind, my $11,000 receipt burning a hole in my purse, watching my husband slide my family heirloom onto another woman's finger. The sheer audacity of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Every late-night meeting, every expensive suit, every time he called me crazy and needy. It all snapped into brutal, horrifying focus. He was not just cheating on me. He was replacing me, using my money to fund the venue, using my family heirloom to seal the deal. The string quartet shifted into a lively, celebratory song. Victoria threw her arms around David's neck, pulling him into a passionate kiss. David wrapped his arms around her waist, spinning her around in the center of the rose petals I had paid for. I did not scream. I did not cry. The shock was too absolute, too profound for tears. Instead, a cold, sharp clarity washed over me. Every ounce of love, every ounce of loyalty I had ever felt for the man spinning in front of me evaporated into the Chicago night air. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sharp click of my heel against the stone terrace cut through the music. Then I took another step. David set Victoria down, laughing. He turned his head toward the door, probably expecting the waitstaff to bring out the champagne I had pre-ordered. His eyes met mine. The smile vanished from his face so fast it was almost comical. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. His hand, still resting on Victoria's waist, suddenly dropped to his sides as if she had caught fire. Victoria, noticing his sudden change in demeanor, turned around to follow his gaze. She looked at me, taking in my red silk dress, my frozen expression, and the fierce, unblinking way I was staring at the man she had just agreed to marry. She frowned, a look of mild irritation crossing her elegant features. "David?" She asked, her voice carrying a tone of corporate authority. "Who is this person? Why is she interrupting our evening?" David swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the rooftop, looking for an escape, looking for security, looking for any way out of the trap he had just walked into. But there was no escape. We were hundreds of feet in the air, and I was blocking the only exit. I did not wait for his answer. I kept my eyes locked on his, my voice deadly calm when I finally spoke. "That is an excellent question, Victoria," I said, taking another step forward into the candlelight. "David, why don't you tell your new fiancée exactly who I am? And while you are at it, why don't you tell her who really paid for this rooftop and whose grandmother actually owns that ring on her finger?" The clutch slipped from my fingers. It hit the stone terrace with a sharp, heavy thud that cracked through the romantic melody of the string quartet. The musicians faltered their bows, scraping awkwardly against their cellos before grinding to a complete halt. Victoria turned first. She moved with the slow, irritated grace of a woman who was absolutely unaccustomed to having her moments ruined. Her perfectly styled hair barely shifted as she looked over her shoulder, her manicured eyebrows pulling together in a tight frown of aristocratic annoyance. Then David turned. If I live to be 100 years old, I will never forget the look on my husband's face in that exact second. The blood completely vanished from his skin. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened so much I could see the whites all the way around his pupils. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark and finally felt the ground disappear beneath his boots. I did not scream. I did not burst into hysterical tears. I felt a cold, terrifying numbness spread through my veins, replacing the blood with ice water. I stepped forward. My heels crunched over the deep red rose petals that I had carefully selected and paid for just 3 weeks ago. I walked directly into the center of the floral heart, closing the distance between me and the man I had spent my entire 20s supporting. Victoria took a step back, clutching her silk shawl around her shoulders. David remained frozen on one knee. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked jerks. But my eyes were no longer on his face. My gaze was entirely fixed on his hands, specifically on the small black velvet box resting in his right palm. As I got closer, the details of that box came into sharp, horrifying focus. It was not a new box from a luxury jeweler. The black velvet was worn thin around the corners from decades of being handled. And as I looked down at the open lid, I saw the pale cream silk lining the inside. Stamped right into the center of that silk, slightly faded by time, were two gold initials, A and M, my grandmother's initials, Alice Montgomery. My heart physically hurt, a sharp twisting pain in the center of my chest. Nestled inside that stolen box was my grandmother's 2-carat vintage diamond ring. It was an antique cushion, cut diamond set in platinum, surrounded by a halo of tiny sapphires. It was the ring my grandfather had saved up for years to buy her in the 1950s. It was the ring she had worn every single day of her life until the week she passed away, leaving it to me as her most prized possession. Just 2 weeks ago, I had noticed the clasp holding the main diamond was feeling a little loose. I was terrified of losing the stone. I had wrapped that ring carefully in a soft cloth, placed it in its original velvet box, and handed it to David while he was drinking his morning coffee. I had looked my husband in the eye and asked him to drop it off at our bank safe deposit box during his lunch hour, just until we could afford to take it to a specialty jeweler for repairs. He had smiled, kissed my forehead, and promised me it would be safe. He had not taken it to the bank. He had held on to it, waiting for the perfect moment to use my family heritage to propose to his wealthy boss. He used my money to rent the venue, and he used my grandmother's ring to seal his fraudulent engagement. David. I said, my voice eerily calm, carrying clearly across the quiet rooftop. Give me back my ring. Victoria snapped her head toward me, her annoyance instantly morphing into deep confusion. She looked down at David, who was still kneeling, completely paralyzed. Then she looked back at me, taking in my red evening gown and the sheer intensity of my stare. David, Victoria demanded, her voice cracking like a whip. Who is this woman? Why is she claiming this is her ring? I looked at Victoria. Up close, I could see the confusion masking a rising panic in her eyes. She was a billionaire CEO, a woman who controlled thousands of employees and massive tech acquisitions. But right now, she was just a woman standing in a circle of roses, realizing something was terribly wrong. I will tell you exactly who I am, I started to say. Preparing to lay bare 5 years of marriage, $80,000 of paid-off student loans, and every lie this man had ever spun. But David finally moved. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked Victoria over. He snapped the velvet box shut and shoved it deep into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He did not look apologetic. He did not look ashamed. Instead, a terrifying, desperate survival instinct took over his features. The man I had shared a bed with for 5 years completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger willing to do whatever it took to protect his lies. Victoria, please step back, David said, using a smooth, authoritative tone I had never heard him use before. He stepped directly between me and his CEO, putting out a hand to shield her, as if I were a physical threat. I stared at him, genuinely shocked. David, what are you doing? Hand me my grandmother's ring right now. He turned to Victoria, leaning in close to her ear, but speaking just loud enough for me to hear. I am so incredibly sorry about this, darling, he murmured, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. This is Sarah. She is a former administrative assistant from my old startup. I had to let her go last year due to some severe mental health issues, and she has been completely delusional ever since. She developed an obsession with me. I have had to involve building security before. The words hit me so hard I actually stumbled back a step. I felt the air leave my lungs. A delusional former assistant. An obsession. He had told her he was a wealthy, independent tech prodigy who built his own startups. He had completely erased our marriage, my financial support, my existence. And now, cornered with the undeniable truth, he was choosing to gaslight me on the spot, painting his own wife as an unstable stalker to save his relationship with a billionaire. "Are you out of your mind?" I shouted, the calm facade finally shattering. The sheer audacity of his lie ignited a furious fire in my chest. "Victoria, I am his wife. We have been married for 5 years. I paid for his entire college debt. I paid $11,000 to rent this exact rooftop tonight because he told me he was working late." David let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shaking his head with an expression of deep pity. "Victoria, please do not listen to her," he said, keeping his eyes fixed on his boss. "She does this. She creates these elaborate fantasies. She finds out my schedule. She follows me to events she tries to claim my successes are hers. I should have filed that restraining order months ago. I just felt so sorry for her." He said it with such absolute conviction, with such a perfect blend of concern and exhaustion, that for a split second, even I felt disoriented. It was a masterclass in manipulation. He was entirely calm while I was standing there shivering in the cold wind, raising my voice and demanding answers. To a stranger, he looked like the rational one, and I looked exactly like the crazy woman he was describing. Victoria looked between us, her sharp eyes taking in my distressed state and David's protective posture. She did not know me. She had no reason to believe a stranger bursting onto a private rooftop over the man she was apparently deeply in love with. "David, this is completely unacceptable," Victoria said, her corporate armor sliding firmly back into place. "How did she even get up here? We paid for exclusive access. Get security immediately. I will not have our night ruined by some unhinged former employee." She turned her back to me, wrapping her shawl tighter, effectively dismissing my existence. I stepped around David, trying to get to her. "Victoria, you have to look at the facts. Look at the ring box in his pocket. It has the initials A and M inside. Why would a custom ring box have random initials? Because it belongs to my family." David moved aggressively, blocking my path and grabbing me by the upper arm. His grip was tight, bruising a silent warning to shut my mouth. I tried to pull away, but he leaned his face down to mine, his eyes completely dead. "You are going to leave right now, Sarah." He hissed, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for me. "You are going to turn around, get in the elevator, and go back to your pathetic small life. If you ruin this for me, I swear to God I will absolutely destroy you in court. You will walk away with nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing." I stared into the eyes of the man I had loved since we were broke 20-somethings eating ramen on a mattress on the floor. There was absolutely nothing recognizable left in him. He was entirely hollowed out by greed. "Let go of my arm," I said quietly, refusing to break eye contact. He squeezed harder. "Security!" David yelled, turning his head toward the heavy mahogany doors. "We need security on the terrace immediately. We have a trespasser." The doors burst open. The maitre d' rushed out, followed closely by 2 massive men in dark suits. The maitre d' looked incredibly flustered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I am so sorry, sir," the maitre d' said, addressing David and Victoria. She bypassed the lobby desk. We tried to stop her, but the elevator was already moving. "Remove her from the premises," David commanded, stepping back and straightening his suit jacket. "She is harassing us and making violent threats. If she resists, call the police." The 2 security guards closed in on me immediately. One grabbed my left arm, the other grabbed my right. They were not gentle. Their heavy hands clamped down on my bare skin, pulling me backward away from the center of the terrace, away from the rose petals I had paid for, away from the husband who had just erased our entire life together. "Wait!" I struggled against their grip, digging my heels into the stone floor. "I am the one who rented this space. My name is on the contract. I have the receipt in my purse right here. Check the reservation under Sarah Myers. Check the credit card on file." "Ma'am, you need to come with us right now," the larger guard said, ignoring every word coming out of my mouth. "If you keep fighting, we are calling the Chicago Police Department." Walk toward the elevator. I looked at the maitre d', desperate for someone to acknowledge the truth. Please, I begged him. You know I am the one who checked in. I told you I had the reservation. Look at the name on the account. The maitre d' would not meet my eyes. He looked down at his tablet, then over at Victoria, the billionaire CEO whose company probably hosted dozens of lucrative events at this restaurant every year. He made a rapid, silent calculation about who had more power in this situation. I have no record of a Sarah Myers. The maitre d' lied smoothly, looking directly at the security guards. This space was booked under Victoria's corporate account. Please escort the trespasser out of the building. The betrayal felt complete. Money and power had instantly rewritten reality. My $11,000 meant nothing. My marriage meant nothing. The truth meant absolutely nothing. The guards shoved me forward, forcing me through the mahogany doors and into the small elevator vestibule. Through the glass, I caught one final glimpse of the rooftop. David was standing with his arm around Victoria, rubbing her shoulder comfortingly. He was looking at her, playing the protective, devoted partner. He did not look back at me once. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the skyline and the candlelight. The ride down to the ground floor was a blur of humiliation. The guards flanked me tightly, their expressions stony. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored walls of the elevator. My hair was blown wildly from the wind, my mascara was slightly smudged, and my red silk dress felt like a ridiculous costume. I looked like exactly what David had called me, a crazy, desperate woman who did not belong there. When the doors opened in the lobby, the guards marched me straight across the marble floor past the staring diners at the front bar and pushed me through the revolving glass doors. "Do not come back here, ma'am," one guard warned, blocking the entrance. "If you step foot on this property again, you will be arrested for trespassing." They turned around and walked back inside, leaving me alone on the sidewalk. The February wind in Chicago cuts through you like tiny knives. I was wearing nothing but a sleeveless silk dress and a pair of heels. I did not have a coat. I did not have my car keys. I had dropped my clutch on the rooftop, which meant David had my phone, my credit cards, and my identification. All I had was the cold pavement beneath my feet, and the crushing realization that my entire life had just been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. I stood on the freezing street corner, wrapping my bare arms around myself, shaking uncontrollably. But as I stood there in the bitter cold, watching the luxury cars pull up to the valet stand, the shock began to recede. The numbness that had protected me on the rooftop slowly melted away, and in place of it, something completely different began to burn. David thought he had won. He thought he could steal my money, steal my grandmother's ring, and throw me onto the street like garbage while he married a billionaire. He thought because I had spent my 20s quietly paying his bills and managing our lives in the background that I was weak. He thought I would just disappear. He forgot one very important detail. I am an accountant. I know exactly where every single penny in our marriage came from, where it went, and how it was filed. I know his social security number, his banking passwords, and the complete history of his financial existence. I stopped shivering. I stood up straight on the freezing Chicago pavement. I did not have my phone, my coat, or my husband. But I had my mind, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. David wanted to pretend our marriage did not exist. I was going to make absolutely certain that he would never, ever be able to forget it. The bitter wind off Lake Michigan whipped against my bare shoulders like shattered glass as I forced my legs to carry me away from the restaurant. Every step in my heels sent a dull ache shooting up my calves, but I refused to stop moving. I refused to let the security guard standing by the revolving doors see even a single tear fall from my eyes. I marched 3 blocks down the frozen Chicago pavement toward the dim concrete parking structure where I had left my 10-year-old Honda Civic. I was shivering so violently that my teeth physically rattled together, yet my mind was moving with a strange, terrifying clarity. I did not have my purse. I did not have my winter coat. I had nothing but the red silk evening gown clinging to my freezing skin and the spare car key I kept hidden inside a magnetic box tucked up under my rear bumper. I dropped to my knees on the oily concrete floor of the parking garage, scraping my bare skin against the rough ground. My fingers were completely numb, clumsy, and slow as I reached under the cold metal chassis of the car. After several agonizing seconds of fumbling in the dark, my hand brushed against the small plastic box. I pulled it free, pried it open, and practically collapsed against the driver's side door as the locks clicked open. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut against the howling wind, and immediately cranked the engine. I turned the heater on full blast, pressing my freezing hands directly against the plastic vents, waiting for the warm air to bring feeling back into my extremities. I popped open the center console. Sitting right at the bottom, buried under a pile of old gas receipts and charging cables, was my bulky company-issued backup smartphone. I kept it in the car strictly for off-site accounting emergencies when my primary phone battery died during tax season. It was fully charged. I turned it on and quickly synced it to my personal cloud account right there in the driver's seat. As soon as the data loaded, a flood of missed notifications from my primary number began cascading across the screen. I ignored them all. I shifted the car into drive, gripping the worn steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I needed to get home. I needed to look David in the eye, away from his billionaire CEO and his private security guards. I needed to stand in the living room of the house I had helped pay for and demand to know how long he had been living this horrific double life. The drive to our modest suburban house took 45 minutes. The entire way, my mind scrambled to construct a timeline. He had stolen my grandmother's ring 2 weeks ago. He had been working late for 8 months. He had changed his wardrobe, his cologne, his entire vocabulary over the past year. I had spent every single day of my 20s sacrificing my own comfort to build a foundation for us, completely unaware that he was using that foundation to build a launchpad for himself. I turned onto our quiet, tree-lined street. The neighborhood was completely dark, the houses sitting silently behind manicured lawns. I pulled into our driveway and shifted the car into park. The porch light was off. The windows were dark. The house looked exactly as it always did when I came home late from the accounting firm. I stepped out of the car, the freezing night air hitting my silk dress again, and walked up the concrete path to the front door. I reached under the heavy ceramic planter box on the porch, my fingers finding the spare house key we had kept hidden there for 5 years. I slid the cold metal key into the brass deadbolt. I turned my wrist, expecting the familiar heavy click of the mechanism. The key did not turn. I frowned, pulling the key out and wiping it on my dress before sliding it back into the lock. I twisted my wrist harder, jiggling the handle, putting my shoulder against the heavy wood. The lock refused to budge. The mechanism inside felt completely different, stiff and foreign. I stepped back, my breath pluming in the freezing air. I walked quickly around the side of the house, my heels sinking into the frosty grass, and tried the back door leading into the kitchen. I slid the key into the lock. It jammed halfway in. I stood perfectly still on the back patio, staring at the brass handle. The reality of the situation washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. The locks had been changed. David had not just planned a lavish proposal on a rooftop tonight. He had systematically planned my eviction. He had hired a locksmith to change the deadbolts while I was downtown sitting in a restaurant waiting to surprise him. He had orchestrated every single detail to ensure that when the night ended, I would be completely locked out of my own life. I walked slowly back to the front driveway, the shock deepening into a hollow, echoing void in my chest. As I approached the front of the garage, the headlights of my idling car illuminated something piled next to the trash cans. There were 6 heavy-duty black garbage bags sitting on the wet concrete. I walked over to them, my hands trembling as I pulled at the plastic knot tying the first bag shut. The plastic ripped open. Inside, I saw my winter sweaters, my work blouses, and a pair of my running shoes thrown haphazardly together. I opened the second bag. It was filled with my bathroom toiletries, my makeup brushes, and a framed photograph of my late mother that used to sit on my nightstand. The glass on the frame was cracked perfectly down the middle. My phone buzzed loudly in my hand, making me jump. I looked down at the bright screen. It was a text message. But it was not from David. It was from his younger sister, Emily. Emily was 30 years old, fiercely entitled, and deeply convinced that she was the main character in everyone else's life. For 5 years, I had been the reliable, quiet sister-in-law who made sure Emily's life ran smoothly. When she started a failed boutique bakery 3 years ago, I spent countless weekends balancing her books and fixing her ruined tax returns completely free of charge. When she got married, I was the one who paid the caterer's final balance, because she had gone wildly over budget and called me sobbing in a panic. I had protected her, supported her, and treated her like blood. I opened the message. There was a photo attached. It was a picture of the exact black garbage bags I was currently standing in front of, taken during the daylight. Beneath the photo was a text message. David told me you went psycho at his corporate event. He is moving on Sarah. Stop embarrassing yourself and sign the divorce papers quietly. I stared at the words glowing on the screen, reading them over and over until the letters began to blur. Emily had known. She had known about Victoria. She had known about the proposal. She had come to my house today, the house I paid the mortgage on, and she had helped her brother stuff my entire existence into plastic trash bags while I was at work. She had packed my mother's photograph. She had walked through my bedroom, going through my intimate belongings, casually erasing me from the family while she texted her friends. The cruelty of it was absolute. It was not just a cheating husband. It was an entire family turning against me, tossing me aside the exact second I was no longer useful to them. I was the stepping stone they had all used to cross the river, and now that they were on the other side, they were kicking me into the water. I stood in the freezing driveway staring at the black bags. The temperature was dropping fast, slipping well below freezing. I was standing outside in a sleeveless silk gown. I could not get into the house. I had no money, no credit cards, and no safe place to go at midnight. But I knew I could not stay here, and I knew I could not survive the night in a silk dress. I looked past the garbage bags toward the detached garage at the end of the driveway. David had always hated having my clutter inside the main house. He claimed my financial files and old winter gear ruined the sleek modern aesthetic of his home office. Years ago, he had forced me to move my heavy winter coats and my personal fireproof lockbox out to the dusty, unheated garage. The garage door was locked with an electronic keypad, and I knew David would have changed the code. But there was a small single-pane window on the side of the structure facing the tall wooden fence that separated our yard from the neighbors. I walked over to the side of the garage, the frost crunching loudly beneath my shoes. I searched the frozen dirt until my numb fingers wrapped around a heavy, jagged landscaping rock. I did not hesitate. I did not care about the noise. I lifted the heavy stone and slammed it directly into the center of the window pane. The glass shattered inward with a loud, violent crash, the sharp shards raining down onto the concrete floor inside. I knocked the remaining jagged edges of glass out of the wooden frame, using the rock wrapped my bare arm in the loose fabric of my silk skirt to protect my skin and reach through the broken window. I felt blindly along the inside of the door until my fingers found the heavy metal latch. I twisted it hard. The lock gave way with a satisfying click. I pushed the side door open and stepped into the pitch-black garage. The air inside smelled of cold motor oil, damp cardboard, and lawn fertilizer. I used the flashlight on my backup phone to cut through the darkness. I moved quickly past David's expensive golf clubs and his perfectly organized tool bench, making my way to the back corner where my plastic storage bins were stacked. I tore the lid off the first bin. Sitting right on top was my heavy waterproof winter parka. I pulled it out and shoved my freezing arms into the thick down-lined sleeves, zipping it all the way up to my chin. The immediate warmth was a small, profound victory. I dropped to my knees and pulled the remaining plastic bins aside until I saw it sitting on the cold concrete floor. My heavy gray fireproof lockbox. It weighed almost 30 pounds. Inside that box was my birth certificate, my social security card, my passport, my professional accounting licenses, and every single hard copy of my tax returns for the last 10 years. It was my entire legal and financial identity. I grabbed the heavy metal handle of the lockbox and dragged it out of the corner. I did not bother closing the garage door behind me. I hauled the heavy box across the frosty driveway, lifted it with aching, exhausted arms, and shoved it into the back seat of my Honda Civic. I got back into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I sat there for a long moment staring at the dark house. The house I had painted the walls of. The house where I had fixed the leaking kitchen sink to save us plumber fees, so David could afford his expensive networking dinners. The house that was completely closed off to me now. I shifted the car into reverse, backed out of the driveway, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. I drove aimlessly for 20 minutes. The heater blasting my hands, gripping the steering wheel, as the adrenaline slowly began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. I needed a place to park where nobody would bother me, a place where it was safe to sleep in a car. I merged onto the highway and headed toward the commercial district on the edge of the suburbs, eventually pulling into the massive, brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart. I parked the car in the far back corner of the lot, directly under the harsh glare of a towering yellow sodium street lamp. There were a few other cars scattered around the lot, mostly overnight shift workers and long-haul truckers resting in their cabs. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence inside the car was deafening. I reached up and pulled the lever on the side of my seat, reclining it as far back as it would go. I pulled my heavy winter parka tighter around my body, trying to cover the red silk of my evening gown. The contrast was absolutely absurd. I was a successful, educated financial professional, 29 years old, sleeping in a freezing 10-year-old car in a retail parking lot while wearing a formal dress. I stared up at the stained fabric of the car ceiling. That was when the tears finally came. They did not come in a gentle, sad stream. They hit me like a violent physical illness. I gasped for air, my chest heaving, my hands covering my face as the absolute magnitude of the betrayal crashed down on me. I cried for the $11,000 I had thrown away. I cried for the 5 years of my youth I had sacrificed to pay off the debts of a man who viewed me as nothing more than a stepping stone. I cried for the vicious cruelty of Emily packing my mother's photograph into a garbage bag. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes burned. I cried until there was absolutely nothing left inside of me to give them. And then slowly the tears stopped. The silence returned to the cold car. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my parka and took a long, deep breath of the freezing air. The profound grief that had overwhelmed me just minutes ago began to harden, cooling and solidifying into something entirely different. The sadness burned away like dry kindling, leaving nothing behind but cold, calculated fury. David thought he had won because he had the house, the billionaire fiancé, and the perfect exit strategy. Emily thought she had won because she got the last word in a cruel text message. They thought I was just the quiet, compliant accountant who would accept defeat, sign the divorce papers, and fade away into the background. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I closed my eyes in the harsh yellow light of the parking lot, my mind already shifting into the methodical, ruthless precision of a forensic audit. They had taken my past, but I was absolutely going to dismantle their future. The pale morning sun filtered through the frost-covered windshield of my 10-year-old car, casting long, cold shadows across the dashboard. I woke up shivering violently, my neck cramped and aching from sleeping completely upright in the driver's seat. The Walmart parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few delivery trucks idling in the distance. For a brief, disorienting second, my mind tried to trick me into believing I was safely tucked into my warm bed at home, and that the events of the previous night had just been a horrifying nightmare. But the heavy down parka wrapped around my shoulders and the red silk evening gown pooled around my freezing legs brought reality crashing down with brutal force. I sat up straight, rubbing the stiffness from my arms. There was no time for tears today. The crushing grief that had hollowed me out in the middle of the night had completely burned away, leaving behind a sharp, brilliant clarity. I reached into the back seat and pulled the heavy gray fireproof lockbox into the passenger seat. I popped open the latches and ran my fingers over the neat stacks of manila folders inside. Everything I needed to rebuild my life was sitting right there. But before I could rebuild, I needed to understand exactly how much damage David had done. I started the engine, waiting agonizingly long minutes for the heater to blow warm air, and drove out of the lot. 2 miles down the road, I found an old 24-hour diner. It was the kind of place with faded vinyl booths, the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air, and neon signs buzzing faintly in the windows. It was perfectly anonymous. I grabbed my lockbox, and my laptop, walked inside and slid into a corner booth facing the door. A tired-looking waitress with a stained apron poured me a mug of black coffee without saying a word. I thanked her, took a burning sip, and opened my laptop. The diner had free internet. I connected, took a deep breath, and opened my web browser. My first priority was securing whatever liquid assets I still had. I navigated to the portal for our joint checking and savings accounts. I typed in my credentials, my fingers moving quickly over the keys. The page loaded. I stared at the screen. The balance in our primary checking account was $0.00. The savings account, which held the meager emergency fund I had meticulously built by cutting coupons and skipping lunches, was also sitting at absolute zero. I clicked on the transaction history. At exactly 11:15 last night, while I was sitting in my freezing car crying over my broken marriage, David had initiated a wire transfer. He had drained every single penny into a private external account that I did not recognize. He had even taken my most recent paycheck from the accounting firm, which had direct deposited just hours earlier. A normal person might have panicked. A normal person might have started screaming or hyperventilating right there in the diner booth. But I am an accountant. When I look at a bank statement, I do not just see numbers. I see a narrative. I see behavior. I see a trail of breadcrumbs left by someone who thinks they are smarter than everyone else in the room. David taking the cash was not just petty theft. It was a tactical strike. He was trying to paralyze me financially so I could not hire legal counsel or secure housing. He wanted me desperate. I closed the banking tab. The cash was gone, but cash is only one part of a financial identity. I needed the full picture. I navigated to the official credit reporting agencies. Working in corporate finance, I knew exactly how to pull a comprehensive credit profile without triggering any security alerts. I requested my full reports from Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. I immediately initiated a global freeze on my social security number, locking down my identity so David could not open any new accounts in my name. Once the freeze was confirmed, I downloaded the PDF reports and began scanning the trade lines. The first few pages were completely standard. My student loans were fully paid off. The mortgage on our suburban house was listed showing current payments. My single credit card with a $3,000 limit had a zero balance. I scrolled down to the next page, my eyes scanning the rows of data with practiced efficiency. Then I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. I leaned closer to the bright screen, squinting at a trade line that made absolutely no sense. There was an open line of credit listed under my name. It was a home equity line of credit established 7 months ago. The balance was staggering. $250,000. My hands began to shake slightly as I looked at the details. $250,000 had been borrowed against a property, and the account was entirely in my name as the primary guarantor. I looked at the property address tied to the loan and felt the blood drain from my face. It was the cabin. Located on a quiet, remote lake in northern Wisconsin, the small wooden cabin was the only thing my mother had left me when she passed away 10 years ago. It was not a luxury vacation home. It was a modest, weathered sanctuary, surrounded by towering pine trees smelling of cedar and old books. It was the place where I had learned to fish, where I had spent my childhood summers, and where I felt most connected to the mother I missed every single day. The property was owned free and clear. It was entirely in my name, a premarital asset that I had explicitly kept separate from David to protect it. Or so I thought. I pulled up the county property records database, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. I searched the tax parcel number for the cabin. The digital deed pulled up on my screen, followed by a recorded lien from a major national bank. I downloaded the loan origination documents. As I scrolled to the final page, I saw it. my signature. It was a digital DocuSign authorization perfectly executed, but I had never seen this document in my life. I checked the timestamp and the IP address attached to the digital signature certificate. The document had been signed on a Tuesday evening last July. I distinctly remembered that specific Tuesday because it was the final week of corporate tax season. I had been at my firm until 10 at night. The IP address on the signature log traced directly back to our home internet router. David had sat in his home office, logged into my email account, intercepted the loan documents, and forged my digital signature to mortgage my mother's cabin for $250,000. The sheer breathtaking evil of his actions washed over me, replacing the cold diner air with a suffocating heat. He had not just stolen my savings. He had violated my most sacred personal possession. He had gambled away the only piece of my mother I had left. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm and bitter, but I needed the caffeine to keep my mind sharp. I pushed the grief away. Grief is a luxury for people who have time. I was at war and I needed intelligence. I needed to know where $250,000 had gone. Using my professional access and a few perfectly legal forensic tracking methods I had learned during my corporate audits, I started tracing the routing numbers connected to the loan dispersal. A massive lump sum had been deposited into an LLC that David had registered in Delaware. He had cleverly named it using my initials to make it look like a joint venture, giving him full access to move the capital. I pulled the transaction history for that LLC. What I found was a detailed chronological blueprint of a massive, pathetic lie. The bank statements told the story of a man buying a fake identity. The very first transaction, made 3 days after he stole the equity from my cabin, was a massive down payment to a luxury car dealership. That explained the brand new Porsche 911 he had suddenly brought home, claiming it was a company lease provided by his generous new CEO. It was not a company car. He was paying for it with my mother's legacy. I kept scrolling. The charges became increasingly obscene. $30,000 wired to an elite country club downtown for an initiation fee. $12,000 spent at a high-end jeweler for a Patek Philippe watch. Thousands of dollars dropped at bespoke tailors, luxury steakhouses, and exclusive charity galas. David had used the $250,000 to construct an elaborate, flawless costume. He had bought his way into Victoria's elite social circle. He needed to look like he belonged in her world of billionaires and heirs. He could not just be a guy from the suburbs whose wife worked 60 hours a week to pay off his student loans. He had to become a self-made, independently wealthy tech entrepreneur. He funded his entire fake trust fund lifestyle using the equity of a dead woman's cabin. I stared at the screen as the final horrifying piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I finally understood his master plan. It was terrifyingly brilliant. David knew he could not keep the facade up forever. Eventually, the money from the cabin would run out. But he did not need it to last forever. He only needed it to last long enough to secure Victoria's hand in marriage. Once he married into her billionaire family, his financial problems would permanently vanish. But there was still the problem of me. He could not marry Victoria while he was legally tied to a junior accountant in the suburbs. That was why Emily had texted me last night, urging me to sign the divorce papers quietly. David was preparing to blindside me with a rapid, aggressive divorce. By framing me as a crazy, unstable woman, he was laying the groundwork to rush the legal proceedings. He assumed I would be so devastated, so completely broken by the betrayal and the eviction that I would just sign whatever papers his lawyer shoved in front of me just to make the pain stop. And hidden deep within those divorce papers would undoubtedly be a clause holding me solely responsible for the debts attached to properties in my name. If his plan worked, we would divorce quietly. I would walk away with zero cash. I would be legally saddled with $250,000 in fraudulent debt. Because the debt was secured by the cabin, the bank would inevitably foreclose on it when I failed to make the massive monthly payments. I would lose my mother's home, my credit score would be destroyed, and I would be forced into absolute financial ruin. Meanwhile, David would be standing at an altar in a custom tuxedo marrying a billionaire CEO completely free of debt and completely free of me. I closed the laptop gently. The hinge made a soft click that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet diner. I looked out the window at the morning traffic beginning to build on the street. The sun was fully up now, reflecting off the wet pavement. I felt a profound, chilling calmness settle into my bones. David had made a fatal error. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption that I was weak. He believed that because I had spent the last 5 years quietly serving him, cooking his meals, paying his bills, and shrinking myself to make room for his ego, I possessed no spine. He thought my kindness was synonymous with stupidity. He thought I was just the background character in the movie of his life, easily written out when the plot no longer required my services. He had completely forgotten who he was dealing with. He forgot that I was the one who managed the numbers. I was the one who understood the fine print. I was the one who had dragged us out of poverty while he was busy complaining about how hard the world was. I packed my laptop back into my heavy bag. I picked up the gray fireproof lockbox and slid out of the vinyl booth. I walked to the front counter, handed the waitress a $20 bill for a $3 cup of coffee, and walked out the door into the freezing morning air. I had been locked out of my home. I had been betrayed by my husband and my sister-in-law. My life savings were gone, and my family legacy was buried under a mountain of fraudulent debt. I had absolutely nothing left to lose, and a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on earth. I unlocked the door to my Honda Civic, threw the lockbox onto the passenger seat, and climbed behind the wheel. I did not need to cry anymore. I did not need to wonder why I was not enough for him. I had all the answers I needed sitting on a hard drive in my bag. David wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate fraud and financial ruin. He wanted to steal my past to fund his future. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the diner parking lot, my mind calculating the exact legal maneuvers required to dismantle a man's entire existence. I was going to let David think he was winning. I was going to let him believe his perfect plan was coming together exactly as he had designed it. And then when he was standing at the very peak of his new fake life, I was going to push him off the edge. I knew the exact limits of my own power. I could read a spreadsheet like a printed language. I could spot a hidden asset across a decade of tax returns and track a wire transfer through a dozen offshore accounts. But I was not a legal tactician. David had already retained a high-priced corporate firm to handle our divorce, the kind of firm that specializes in burying middle-class spouses in endless paperwork until they surrender out of sheer financial exhaustion. If I walked into a standard police precinct and reported a forged digital signature on a real estate loan, the desk sergeant would hand me a case number and tell me it was a civil matter. The bank would absolutely still foreclose on my mother's cabin, while the detective spent 2 years slowly investigating an IP address. I did not have 2 years. I did not have 2 months. I needed a predator. I needed someone who understood the venomous intersection of corporate fraud and marital destruction. I needed Thomas Thorne. I remembered Thomas from an intense corporate audit I conducted 3 years ago for a logistics company that was being completely gutted by its own board of directors. Thomas was the independent counsel who stepped in to represent the defrauded employees. He was in his late 60s, semi-retired, and operated out of a beautifully restored brick building in the historic district. He possessed a legendary reputation for being ruthlessly efficient. More importantly, Thomas harbored a deep-seated, very vocal hatred for modern tech executives. He despised the arrogance of men who believed a slick presentation and a venture capital backing somehow excused them from basic human morality and the rule of law. I pulled my frozen car into the parking lot of his building just before 9 in the morning. I hauled my heavy gray fireproof lockbox up the 3 flights of stairs because I could not bring myself to wait for the vintage elevator. I burst through his heavy oak doors without an appointment. His receptionist looked alarmed, but Thomas stepped out of his office, a mug of black coffee in his hand, and took one look at my face. He took in the heavy winter parka, the red silk evening gown peeking out from the bottom, and the absolute exhaustion carved into my features. He did not ask any meaningless questions. He simply opened his door wider and motioned for me to come inside. I sat in a heavy leather chair across from his mahogany desk and laid out the entire situation. I told him about the rooftop in downtown Chicago, the $11,000 I had spent, and the stolen antique diamond ring currently sitting on the finger of a billionaire CEO. Then I opened my lockbox. I handed him the downloaded property records, the digital signature logs, and the banking transaction histories I had pulled at the diner just an hour before. Thomas put on his reading glasses and reviewed the paperwork in absolute silence. For 10 straight minutes, the only sound in the office was the sharp rustle of paper and the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. "This is textbook wire fraud and identity theft," Thomas finally said, setting the papers down and taking off his glasses. "He forged your signature to secure $250,000 against a premarital asset. He drained your joint accounts to leave you financially paralyzed. His strategy is obvious. He intends to hit you with a rapid divorce filing, demanding you assume the debt in exchange for a meager settlement. He believes you will be too traumatized and too broke to fight him in court." I looked Thomas directly in the eye. "I am not traumatized anymore. I am furious. And I am not going to let him take my mother's cabin to fund his fake trust fund lifestyle. I need you to help me destroy him." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Thomas Thorne's weathered face. He reached for his phone and instructed his assistant to cancel his morning appointments. Then he rolled his chair closer to the desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. "If we are going to dismantle a man who thinks he is a genius," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, focused register, "we need to know exactly how he spent the rest of your stolen money. You tracked the down payment on the luxury sports car and the country club initiation fees, but that only accounts for roughly $100,000. There is still $150,000 missing from this home equity line of credit. Tech executives do not just leave that kind of capital sitting in a checking account. They invest it." We spent the next 4 hours turning his office into a war room. We pulled up public records, corporate registries, and every digital breadcrumb David had carelessly left behind in his arrogance. Because David had used our home internet network and my personal email address to originate the fraudulent loan, I was legally entitled to request the complete transfer history directly from the originating bank. Thomas drafted the legal demand, and within an hour the bank complied, sending over the secure wire transfer receipts. We followed the money. The missing $150,000 had not been spent on tailored suits or expensive watches. It had been wired in a single massive lump sum to a private holding company called Apex Data Ventures. I frowned, staring at the glowing monitor on Thomas's desk. "I have never heard of Apex Data Ventures. It sounds like a shell company." "It is a shell company." Thomas confirmed, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he navigated through the Delaware State Corporate Registry. "Let us see what Apex Data Ventures actually does." Thomas pulled the incorporation documents and cross-referenced the entity's investment portfolio. Apex Data Ventures only existed for one singular purpose. It held a significant early-stage equity stake in a rising cloud storage startup called Nexus Innovations. I sat back in the leather chair, rubbing my temples. Why would David dump $150,000 of stolen money into a random cloud storage startup? He works in artificial intelligence, not cloud storage. Thomas did not answer immediately. He was pulling up financial news networks, searching for recent press releases involving Victoria's massive tech conglomerate. He opened an article from a prominent Financial Times website published just 2 days ago and turned the monitor toward me. "Read the headline." Thomas instructed, his voice suddenly thick with suppressed excitement. I leaned forward and read the bold black text. Victoria's conglomerate had just announced they were in the final aggressive stages of a massive corporate acquisition. They were buying out a highly successful cloud storage startup to integrate into their global network. The purchase price was astronomical, expected to send the startup's valuation through the roof the second the ink dried on the merger. The name of the startup being acquired was Nexus Innovations. The air in the office went completely still. The sheer magnitude of what we had just uncovered hit me like a physical shockwave. David did not just steal from me. He was actively committing one of the most severe federal financial crimes possible. As a senior director at Victoria's conglomerate, and as the man sleeping in the CEO's bed, David had intimate, highly classified insider knowledge of the upcoming acquisition. He knew exactly which startup Victoria was planning to buy weeks before the public announcement was made. He had taken the money he stole from my mother's cabin and used it to secretly buy an equity stake in the exact target company right before the buyout. It was textbook insider trading. He is going to multiply that stolen money 10 times over the second Victoria signs the merger documents, I whispered, staring at the screen in absolute horror. He is going to walk away with millions. Yes, he is, Thomas agreed, his eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. But he has a massive problem, Sarah. Insider trading requires extreme secrecy. David could not possibly buy those shares in his own name. Victoria's compliance department audits all senior executives. The Securities and Exchange Commission would flag his name immediately upon the acquisition. He could not put the shares in a friend's name because a man who steals from his own wife does not trust his friends with millions of dollars. He had to use a completely unlinked, fully anonymous shell entity. Thomas tapped the printed Delaware Incorporation documents for Apex Data Ventures that were sitting on the desk. He slid the papers toward me. Look at the managing member of the shell company. Look at who actually owns Apex Data Ventures. I looked down at the crisp, white paper. I scanned past the registered agent details, past the generic corporate addresses, right down to the signature line at the very bottom of the document. My heart completely stopped in my chest. There, printed in bold black ink, was the name of the sole managing member and 100% equity owner of the shell company, Sarah Myers. I covered my mouth with my hand, a breathless laugh escaping my throat. The absolute breathtaking arrogance of my husband was almost unbelievable. In his mind, I was nothing more than a blind, obedient placeholder. He needed an identity with a clean financial record, someone completely disconnected from the tech industry to hold his illegal assets. He had simply hijacked my identity again, assuming I would be too devastated by the divorce and the sudden eviction to ever untangle the complex web of shell companies he had built. He thought he was a criminal mastermind hiding his illegal fortune right underneath his discarded wife's name. He made me the sole legal owner of the shell company, I said, my voice trembling with the realization. Thomas leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He did. And by doing so, your husband has handed you the most powerful weapon imaginable. You see, Sarah, corporate acquisition laws are incredibly strict. When a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate attempts to acquire a startup like Nexus Innovations, they require absolute legal clarity. They require a clean capitalization table. Every single major shareholder in the target company must sign off and release their equity for the merger to go through. I stared at Thomas, the pieces rapidly locking into place inside my mind. Because the shell company is legally registered in my name, I own that equity. Exactly, Thomas said, a genuine, terrifying smile breaking across his face. You legally control a critical block of shares in the startup Victoria is trying to acquire. Neither Victoria nor her board of directors can finalize this massive career-defining merger without the explicit legally binding consent of Apex Data Ventures, which means they cannot finalize the merger without your personal signature. I stood up from the chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the busy city streets below. The freezing, desperate woman who had broken a garage window with a rock just hours ago was completely gone. The profound humiliation of being escorted out of that restaurant by security guards melted away, replaced by an intoxicating, absolute sense of power. David thought he had trapped me in a corner. He thought he had buried me under $250,000 of fraudulent debt while he sailed off into a billionaire lifestyle. Instead, he had unknowingly handed me the keys to his entire existence. I was no longer the victim of a cheating husband. I was the sole legal roadblock to a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. Thomas picked up his pen and tapped it against the desk. We are not just going to report him to the police for forgery, Sarah. We are going to bleed him dry. We are going to let him believe his plan is working perfectly. We are going to wait until the absolute final second, right when he is standing at the pinnacle of his new life, and we are going to drop a nuclear bomb on his entire reality. I turned away from the window and looked at the brilliant, ruthless attorney sitting across from me. I pulled my heavy winter parka off my shoulders and draped it over the back of the chair, revealing the red silk evening gown underneath. I finally felt warm. "Let us build the bomb," I said. 72 hours after I discovered the shell company holding my husband's illegal shares, a man in a rumpled windbreaker knocked on the glass door of Thomas Thorne's law office. I was sitting at the conference table, buried under a mountain of printed bank statements and corporate registry files, when the receptionist escorted him back. He handed me a thick manila envelope, asked me to formally confirm my name, and walked away. I did not need to open the flap to know what was inside. David had officially made his move. I slid the heavy stack of legal documents onto the polished mahogany table. The header on the first page read, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." It was drafted by one of the most ruthless, high-priced family law firms in downtown Chicago. I read through the standard boilerplate language with a detached, clinical focus, flipping past the generic grounds for irreconcilable differences. Then I reached the proposed settlement agreement. My hands tightened around the edges of the paper until my knuckles turned white. I had fully expected David to be greedy. I had expected him to be cruel. But the sheer breathtaking audacity printed on those pages was almost difficult to comprehend. David was generously offering me a one-time lump sum payment of exactly $5,000. His high-priced lawyers called it a nuisance fee, a transitional stipend to supposedly help me secure new housing. In exchange for this $5,000, the contract demanded two non-negotiable conditions. First, I had to sign a draconian non-disclosure agreement permanently, barring me from discussing our marriage, our shared finances, or his new relationship with anyone under penalty of massive financial ruin. Second, and most horrifyingly, the settlement dictated that I would assume 100% of all marital debt currently held in my name. He did not explicitly mention the $250,000 home equity line of credit he had fraudulently taken out against my mother's cabin. He simply buried it under a blanket clause, counting on the fact that I was too uneducated and too emotionally shattered to read the fine print. He wanted to buy my absolute silence for $5,000 while shackling me to $250,000 in stolen money. I pushed the papers across the desk toward Thomas. The older attorney put on his reading glasses, scanned the settlement terms, and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "This is not a legal document," Thomas said, tossing the packet back onto the table with disgust. "This is an insult disguised as a contract. His lawyers must think you are the most gullible woman in the entire state of Illinois. They are attempting to railroad you into assuming a fraudulent debt so he can walk into his billionaire marriage with a perfectly clean balance sheet. He needs this done fast," I realized, looking at the strict response deadline printed at the bottom of the page. He cannot finalize his background checks for the corporate merger if he is entangled in a messy, contested divorce. He needs my signature on that non-disclosure agreement before Victoria's board of directors looks too closely at his personal history. Thomas nodded, steepling his fingers together. "Exactly, which means he is going to apply pressure. He will not do it himself because he wants to maintain the illusion that he is the victim of a deranged stalker. He will send a proxy. He will send someone you used to trust." Less than an hour later, my cell phone vibrated on the desk. The caller identification displayed a name that made my blood run instantly cold. Emily, my sister-in-law. The same woman who had texted me a picture of my belongings stuffed into garbage bags. The woman who had casually thrown away my dead mother's framed photograph while I was locked out of my own home in the freezing cold. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a surge of pure, unadulterated rage rising in my chest. "Answer it," Thomas instructed quietly, sliding a legal pad and a pen across the desk toward me. "Put it on speaker. Let us hear exactly how they plan to force your hand." I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I needed to suppress the angry, betrayed wife and channel the calculating financial auditor. I pressed the green button and placed the phone in the center of the mahogany table. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice soft, hesitant. perfectly mimicking the tone of a woman who had spent the last 3 days crying in a discount retail parking lot. Sarah. Emily sighed heavily into the receiver. She sounded exactly like a disappointed middle school teacher addressing a misbehaving child. I am so glad you finally picked up. I have been so incredibly worried about you. The absolute falsehood of her concern made my stomach churn, but I bit the inside of my cheek to keep my voice steady. Have you? I asked quietly. Of course I have. Emily continued, her tone dripping with toxic, weaponized sympathy. Look, I know things have been messy. I know you are hurting. But David showed me the settlement offer his lawyer sent over this morning. Sarah, you really need to sign it. I looked up at Thomas, who was shaking his head with a look of profound disgust. I leaned closer to the microphone. Emily, he is offering me $5,000. He took everything. He took the house. I am sleeping in my car. I know it seems harsh, Emily cooed, playing her part flawlessly. But you have to be realistic, sweetie. You do not have the money to fight him. David hired the most expensive litigation firm in the city. If you drag this out, they are going to completely bury you in court fees. They will drag your name through the mud. You will end up bankrupt and owing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal penalties. This $5,000 is a gift. It is a fresh start. Just sign the papers, let the past go, and move on. She was threatening me. She was wrapping a financial death sentence in a pretty bow of sisterly advice. She was trying to terrify me into signing away my life so her brother could marry into a billionaire dynasty. What about the debt? I asked, forcing my voice to tremble slightly. The papers say I have to take all the debt in my name. I cannot afford that. Emily scoffed, a short dismissive sound. Sarah, you are an accountant. You will figure it out. You are always so good at managing budgets. David is stepping into a totally different world now. He cannot have old baggage dragging down his credit score. You owe him this much for everything he put up with during your marriage. I closed my eyes. The sheer entitlement was breathtaking. I owed him. I owed the man who had stolen my inheritance, forged fake loans, and proposed to another woman with my grandmother's diamond. I owed him a clean slate. Thomas tapped his pen against the legal pad, giving me a sharp, encouraging nod. It was time to set the trap. I let out a long, ragged breath, perfectly simulating a woman who had just reached her absolute breaking point. I forced a wet, defeated sob into my throat. I am just so tired. Emily, I whispered, making sure my voice cracked on the final syllable. I cannot fight anymore. You are right. I cannot afford his lawyers. I just want this nightmare to be over. I could practically hear the triumphant smile spreading across Emily's face through the phone. I knew you would see reason, Sarah. It is the smartest choice for everyone. I will tell David to expect the signed documents by tomorrow morning. You can just mail them to his attorney. No, I interrupted quickly, maintaining my fragile, broken tone. I am not mailing them. Emily paused, her suspicion instantly flaring. What do you mean? You just said you would sign them. I will sign them, I promised, letting another fake sob slip out. But I need closure, Emily. I spent 5 years of my life with him. I paid off his student loans. I supported him when he had absolutely nothing. I cannot just drop our entire marriage into a generic mailbox like it meant nothing. I need to look him in the eye one last time. Sarah, do not make this difficult. Emily snapped, her fake sympathy completely vanishing. He does not want to see you. You embarrassed him at that rooftop restaurant. I know, I whimpered, leaning hard into the pathetic persona they expected from me. And I am sorry. I just lost my mind for a minute. But I saw the society pages online. I know he and Victoria are hosting their official engagement gala this weekend at the Oak Brook Country Club. The line went dead silent. Emily was calculating the risk. I will bring the signed papers to the gala, I offered, my voice pleading desperate. I will not make a scene. I swear to you, Emily. I will wear something plain. I will walk through the back entrance. I will hand him the signed settlement agreement and the non-disclosure contract, and I will walk away forever. I just need to say goodbye. If he does not let me do this, I will not sign. I will take my chances in court. It was a massive bluff. But I knew David's psychology perfectly. I knew how badly he needed that signed non-disclosure agreement before the corporate merger. I knew he was arrogant enough to believe I was completely broken. "Hold on," Emily muttered. I heard the muffled sound of a hand covering the receiver. She was calling David, who was undoubtedly sitting right next to her, listening to the entire conversation. A full minute passed. I looked at Thomas. He gave me a confident nod. Finally, Emily came back on the line. Her voice was dripping with smug superiority. "Fine," David agrees. "But you listen to me very carefully, Sarah. The gala is this Saturday at 7 in the evening. You will arrive exactly at 8 o'clock. You will enter through the catering doors at the back of the clubhouse. David will meet you in the private coat room. You hand him the signed documents, you say your little goodbye, and you leave immediately. If you step one foot into the main ballroom, or if you try to speak to Victoria, security will physically throw you onto the street, and David will sue you for everything you have left. Do we have a deal?" I smiled. A wide, terrifying smile that did not match the pathetic, weeping voice I projected into the phone. "We have a deal, Emily. I will see you on Saturday. Tell David I am bringing him exactly what he deserves." I ended the call and set the phone down on the mahogany table. The room was perfectly quiet. The heavy rain continued to beat against the tall glass windows of Thomas Thorne's office. Thomas leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at me with profound professional respect. "You are a remarkably dangerous woman, Sarah Myers," he said quietly. I reached out and picked up the insulting divorce settlement, dropping it directly into the office trash can. "I am not dangerous, Thomas. I am just balancing the ledger." The trap was officially set. David and Emily thought they had manipulated a broken, desperate woman into surrendering her entire life for a miserable $5,000. They thought they were granting me the pathetic mercy of a backroom goodbye. They had absolutely no idea that they had just given me a front-row ticket to their absolute destruction. I had 2 days to prepare for the engagement gala. 2 days to gather the corporate documents, secure the stock ownership files, and select the perfect outfit. I was not going to sneak through any catering doors. I was going to walk straight through the front entrance of the Oak Brook Country Club, and I was going to burn David's fraudulent empire to the ground. The drive to the Oak Brook Country Club took exactly 45 minutes from the city. I spent the entire journey in complete silence with the radio turned off, and my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel of my 10-year-old Honda Civic. The weather outside was a bitter, unforgiving chill, typical of early March in the Midwest, but the heater inside my car was running smoothly. I did not feel the cold tonight. I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of betrayal that had crushed my chest just 3 days ago in a discount retail parking lot. Tonight, my veins were pumping with a chilling, absolute clarity. I was no longer a discarded wife begging for an explanation. I was a corporate auditor arriving to balance a ledger that was $250,000 in the red. I turned off the main highway and drove through the towering wrought iron gates of the exclusive country club. The winding driveway was lined with massive oak trees, illuminated by soft golden uplighting. A long line of luxury vehicles crawled slowly toward the grand entrance. I waited patiently behind a row of brand-new Mercedes sedans, gleaming Porsches, and custom Range Rovers. My faded blue economy car stood out like a sore thumb in the sea of extreme concentrated wealth, but I did not feel an ounce of embarrassment. David had spent our entire marriage obsessing over the illusion of wealth. He had stolen my mother's legacy to buy a sports car, just so he could sit in this exact line of traffic and pretend he belonged here. I knew the absolute truth. I owned the only real power in this entire zip code, and it was sitting right next to me on the passenger seat, inside a sleek black leather folio. I pulled up to the valet stand. A young man in a pristine white uniform stepped forward, his eyes darting quickly over my rusted bumper and dented hubcaps. He masked his confusion with a polite professional nod and opened my door. I stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway and handed him my keys. I did not apologize for my vehicle. I did not shrink away from the judging eyes of the wealthy couples stepping out of their luxury cars nearby. I simply adjusted the lapels of my outfit and breathed in the crisp evening air. I was not wearing the delicate red silk evening gown that David had humiliated me in on Valentine's Day. That dress belonged to a naive woman who believed her husband was working late to build a shared future. Tonight I wore a bespoke charcoal gray power suit. It was sharply tailored, uncompromising, and absolutely commanding. I had paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black stiletto heels that made a sharp, rhythmic sound against the stone walkway. My hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant style that left my face completely exposed. I carried no purse, no accessories, and absolutely zero hesitation. I held the black leather folio tightly in my left hand. Inside that folio were the certified documents proving my ownership of the shell company, the forged loan signatures, and the undeniable evidence of massive federal securities violations. I walked up the wide, sweeping stone steps toward the main entrance of the clubhouse. The heavy brass doors were propped open by two uniformed attendants. As I crossed the threshold, the sheer volume of the celebration washed over me. The lobby was a massive vaulted space featuring rich mahogany paneling, towering floral arrangements of white orchids, and a massive crystal chandelier that cast a brilliant, sparkling light over the guests. The air smelled strongly of expensive catering-aged bourbon and heavy designer perfumes. A live string orchestra was playing an upbeat, joyful symphony from somewhere deep inside the main ballroom. I stood near the coat check, perfectly still, allowing my eyes to adjust to the bright lights and the chaotic movement of the crowd. Through the massive open archways leading into the grand ballroom, I could see the engagement and corporate merger celebration in full magnificent swing. David and Victoria had spared absolutely no expense to broadcast their new empire. There were easily 300 people packed into the space. I recognized several faces immediately. I saw prominent venture capitalists I had read about in financial journals. I spotted heavily guarded tech billionaires mingling near the open bar. I saw the distinguished members of the board of directors for Victoria's massive conglomerate, all gathered together, celebrating the multi-million-dollar acquisition they believed was going to make them even richer by Monday morning. And then right in the center of the room, positioned perfectly under the brightest lights, I saw David's family. My breath remained perfectly steady as I watched them. David's mother was wearing a heavily beaded evening gown that looked brand new. She was holding a flute of expensive champagne, throwing her head back and laughing loudly at a joke made by a wealthy investor. David's father was standing right beside her in a rented tuxedo, nodding along, looking around the ballroom with an expression of sheer greedy satisfaction. These were the people who had gladly accepted my free labor for 5 years. These were the people who had happily eaten the holiday dinners I cooked, who had allowed me to clean up their messes and manage their taxes without ever offering a genuine word of thanks. They had known about Victoria. They had known David was financing this fake billionaire lifestyle using fraudulent debt taken out in my name. They were absolutely thrilled to drink $1,000 champagne bought with the stolen equity of my dead mother's cabin. I felt a profound, satisfying coldness settle deep into my stomach. I was not angry at them anymore. Anger requires an emotional attachment. I was simply looking at a collection of liabilities that I was about to systematically liquidate. I did not attempt to blend into the shadows or hide near the floral arrangements. I stepped directly into the center of the grand foyer, allowing the bright chandelier light to catch the sharp angles of my charcoal suit. I stood perfectly straight, holding my leather folio, and simply waited for the perimeter security to inevitably break. David was an arrogant man, but he was incredibly paranoid. He would have specifically instructed his family to watch the doors, expecting me to show up as a weeping, desperate woman crawling to the back entrance to sign his insulting divorce papers in exchange for a $5,000 nuisance fee. It took exactly 90 seconds for someone to spot me. From the far right corner of the foyer, a flash of emerald green sequins caught my attention. It was Emily David's deeply entitled sister. She was marching across the polished marble floor, her face a rigid, horrifying mask of panic and pure fury. Emily had clearly been assigned the role of keeping the discarded wife out of sight. She was expecting to intercept a broken woman in sweatpants, sneaking through the catering hallway. When her eyes registered the tailored power suit, the stiletto heels, and the absolute unbothered authority radiating from my posture, her brain visibly short-circuited. Emily stormed up to me, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble. Before I could even offer a greeting, she reached out and grabbed my right arm with a bruising, desperate grip. Her long fingernails dug painfully into the fine wool fabric of my jacket. "Sarah, what in the world are you doing standing out here in the open?" Emily hissed, her voice a toxic, strained whisper meant to avoid drawing attention from the nearby guests. She leaned in close, bringing the suffocating scent of her overly sweet perfume directly into my personal space. Her eyes were wide, frantic, and darting rapidly toward the ballroom archway to make sure David had not seen us yet. "I explicitly told you on the phone to use the service entrance by the kitchen," Emily demanded, pulling sharply on my arm, trying to physically drag me toward a narrow, dimly lit hallway that led to the private coat checks. "What are you even wearing? You are supposed to be dropping off the signed settlement papers and leaving immediately. Come with me right now before someone sees you and ruins this entire evening." She yanked my arm again, putting her entire body weight into the movement, fully expecting me to yield to her physical force the way I had yielded to her family's demands for half a decade. I did not stumble. I did not move a single inch. I planted my heels firmly against the marble floor, completely stopping her momentum dead in its tracks. The sudden, unyielding resistance threw Emily off balance. She jerked backward, her green sequin dress rustling loudly as she struggled to keep her footing. She looked up at me, genuine shock replacing the anger in her eyes. I had never pushed back before. I had never refused a physical or emotional demand from anyone in the Myers family. I turned my body very slowly to face her fully. I looked down at her hand, which was still clamped tightly around my upper arm. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of fear, distress, or intimidation. I simply stared at her fingers with an expression of absolute freezing disgust. I waited in complete silence. The seconds stretched out, agonizing and thick with tension. I watched the realization slowly crawl across Emily's face as she felt the sheer crushing weight of my gaze. She suddenly realized she was not grabbing a defeated victim. She was holding on to a live wire. Very slowly, very awkwardly, Emily loosened her grip. Her hand fell away from my jacket, retreating to her side like she had just touched something burning hot. "You do not touch me, Emily," I said. My voice was as calm and smooth as a sheet of ice, carrying a dangerous, terrifying quiet that made her physically flinch. "I am not your servant. I am not the woman who fixes your terrible bankrupt bakery taxes for free. And I am absolutely not the pathetic, defeated wife you thought you could bully over a telephone call." Emily took a step back, her mouth opening and closing rapidly. She looked completely lost, completely out of her depth. The arrogant, controlling sister-in-law, who had packed my mother's photograph into a garbage bag, was suddenly trembling in the middle of a country club foyer. "Sarah, you promised," she stammered, the vicious threat in her voice entirely replaced by a creeping, desperate terror. "You promised on the phone that you would sign the non-disclosure agreement tonight. David has security guards stationed everywhere in this building. If you cause a scene out here, he will absolutely destroy you in court. He will leave you with $250,000 in debt. You cannot afford to fight his lawyers. You need that $5,000 settlement to survive. Just give me the papers and walk out that door." I looked at the terrified, greedy woman standing in front of me. She truly believed that debt was a weapon they could use to keep me silent. She had no idea that the debt they created was the exact mechanism that had given me absolute corporate control over her brother's entire destiny. I adjusted my grip on my sleek leather folio, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the corporate stock certificates and the detailed SEC insider trading reports resting safely inside the pockets. "That is the interesting thing about fraudulent debt, Emily," I replied softly, my tone completely conversational and utterly devoid of mercy. "It always has a funny way of finding its way back to the person who truly earned it. I reached up with my free hand and methodically smoothed the lapel of my charcoal jacket where her fingers had wrinkled the fabric. I looked past her trembling shoulders, my gaze locking directly onto the glowing, magnificent archway of the main ballroom. The lively music was still playing. The billionaires were still laughing. The trap was perfectly primed. I am not here to hide in the back room, Emily. I am here to give a wedding gift. I did not wait for her response. I did not look at her again. I simply stepped around her frozen, paralyzed figure and walked straight toward the brilliant light of the celebration. My heels struck the marble floor in a steady, relentless march. I crossed the grand threshold, stepping out of the shadows of a 5-year marriage and walking directly into the lion's den. The grand ballroom of the Oak Brook Country Club was a masterclass in unapologetic aggressive wealth. As I crossed the threshold, stepping off the polished marble of the foyer and onto the plush custom-woven carpet of the main hall, the sheer scale of the illusion David had constructed hit me like a physical force. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, draped in sweeping panels of white silk that caught the light from massive crystal chandeliers. Waitstaff in immaculate white dinner jackets glided silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and caviar. A towering ice sculpture shaped like 2 intertwined swans dominated the center of the room, slowly weeping cold water into a lit basin. This entire spectacle, this room full of tech billionaires, venture capitalists, and high society elites, was built on a foundation of absolute fraud. And standing right in the middle of it, soaking up the adoration of the crowd, was my husband. I paused just inside the doorway, my grip tightening around the smooth leather folio in my hand. I allowed my eyes to adjust to the blinding light and the dizzying motion of 300 guests. I spotted him almost immediately. David was standing near the head table, surrounded by a tight circle of older, wealthy men. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit him with razor-sharp perfection. He held a glass of bourbon in one hand, gesturing animatedly with the other as he told what appeared to be a highly entertaining story. The men around him threw their heads back in laughter, charmed by the brilliant, independent tech prodigy he pretended to be. I watched his face, the easy, relaxed smile, the crinkling at the corners of his eyes, the absolute confidence radiating from his posture. He looked completely unburdened. He looked like a man who had successfully buried his past and was currently dancing on its grave. For a fraction of a second, the ghost of the girl I used to be felt a familiar twist of pain in her chest. But the woman I had become, the woman who had slept in a freezing car and spent the last 72 hours tracing stolen money through corporate shell companies, crushed that pain into dust. I did not feel heartbreak anymore. I felt the cold, terrifying focus of a predator watching its prey step blindly into a trap. I stepped further into the room, walking directly into his line of sight. David turned his head slightly to hand his empty glass to a passing waiter. As he turned back toward his audience, his gaze swept across the room and collided perfectly with mine. The physical transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The charming, relaxed smile completely vanished from his face, wiped away, as if it had been struck by lightning. The color drained from his cheeks so rapidly that his skin took on a sickly gray pallor beneath the warm chandelier light. I watched his entire body stiffen, his shoulders locking into a rigid posture of absolute panic. He blinked rapidly, his mouth parting slightly, trying to process the impossible image standing in front of him. He had expected a weeping, defeated woman in sweatpants cowering by the coat-room doors. He was looking at a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal power suit, standing tall, completely unbothered by the wealth surrounding her. I did not break eye contact. I offered him a very small, utterly humorless smile. David quickly excused himself from the circle of investors. He did not walk toward me. He practically sprinted, weaving through the crowded tables with a frantic, jerky energy that drew confused looks from several nearby guests. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. As he closed the distance between us, the facade of the brilliant corporate executive completely melted away, revealing the terrified, cornered fraud hiding underneath. He reached me before I had taken another 10 steps into the room. He did not say a word of greeting. He lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab my left elbow. His fingers clamped down on my arm with a bruising, desperate force, his nails digging into the fine wool of my jacket. The physical aggression was instantaneous. It was the exact same heavy-handed, intimidating grip he had used on the rooftop restaurant when he ordered security to throw me out into the cold. "What is wrong with you, David?" hissed his voice, dropping into a venomous, furious whisper that barely masked the raw panic underneath. "Are you completely out of your mind? I told Emily you were to stay in the back room." He began to push his weight against me, trying to physically steer my body backward toward the heavy wooden service doors located just behind the main entrance. He was trying to hide me, trying to shove me back into the shadows before Victoria or any of the board members noticed my presence. I planted my black stiletto heels firmly into the plush carpet, locking my knees and dropping my center of gravity. I completely stopped his momentum. The sudden resistance caught him off guard, and he stumbled slightly, his grip slipping just a fraction of an inch. "Take your hand off my arm, David," I said. My voice was perfectly level, carrying no heat, no fear, and no hesitation. He squeezed harder, pulling me closer so no one could hear the sheer terror in his voice. "You are trespassing, Sarah. This is a private corporate event. You have absolutely no right to be here. If you do not turn around and walk out that door right now, I am signaling the security detail. They will drag you out of here in handcuffs. You will be arrested. You will spend the night in a jail cell, and I will personally ensure my lawyers bankrupt you by Monday morning. I will take everything from you." He was sweating now. Tiny beads of moisture had gathered along his hairline. He was throwing every single threat he had left in his arsenal, banking on the hope that I was still the terrified, obedient wife who would crumble under his authority. He thought the threat of police and financial ruin would make me run for the hills. I looked down at his hand gripping my jacket, and then I looked slowly back up into his desperate, lying eyes. I did not flinch. I did not tremble. "You already took everything, David," I replied smoothly, gripping my leather folio tighter. "The only difference is, tonight I am not the one who needs to be worried about facing a judge." David's eyes widened. He let out a harsh, disbelieving breath. "You really are delusional." He released his grip on my arm with a sudden, violent shove, taking a step back and reaching into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket to pull out his cell phone. "You leave me no choice. I am calling the police. I am telling them a deranged stalker has breached a private event. You brought this entirely on yourself, Sarah." He began to dial the numbers, his thumb shaking against the illuminated screen. He was completely committed to the lie. He genuinely believed that if he could just get security to throw me out, he could salvage his perfect night. He thought he still controlled the board, the narrative, and the outcome. He had absolutely no idea that the real power in the room had been watching us for the past 2 minutes. "David," I said, my voice rising just enough to carry over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "Before you make that phone call and embarrass yourself further, there is someone I would like to say hello to." David paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. He frowned, a flash of deep confusion breaking through his anger. He looked at me, then followed my line of sight across the room. Standing roughly 20 feet away near a towering display of white orchids was a distinguished older man holding a glass of sparkling water. He wore a classic black tuxedo that spoke of old money and quiet, absolute authority. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his sharp, calculating eyes were fixed directly on us. It was Arthur Kensington, the chairman of the board for Victoria's massive tech conglomerate. Arthur was the ultimate authority in this room. He controlled the votes, he controlled the acquisitions, and he controlled Victoria's professional future. He was a man who despised public scandals and absolutely abhorred corporate fraud. David let out a sharp, dismissive breath. "You do not know anyone here, Sarah. Stop playing games. That is the chairman of the board. If you even try to walk toward him, I will tackle you to the floor myself." I ignored my husband completely. I bypassed his blocking stance and took 3 confident steps toward the orchids. I raised my hand slightly and smiled a warm, genuine smile. "Arthur." I called out, my voice clear and ringing with professional familiarity. "It is so wonderful to see you tonight." David froze. The color that had slightly returned to his face vanished completely, leaving him looking like a corpse. His phone slipped from his fingers and hit the carpeted floor with a muffled thud. He did not bother to pick it up. Arthur turned fully toward us. The stern, intimidating expression he usually wore in public instantly melted away. A wide, delighted smile broke across his weathered face. He handed his glass to a passing waiter and walked briskly toward me, extending both of his hands in a gesture of profound, genuine respect. "Sarah, my dear Arthur," boomed his deep baritone voice, capturing the attention of several nearby guests. "I was beginning to worry you had decided to skip the festivities. You look absolutely magnificent. I am so glad you could make it." Arthur took my right hand and patted it warmly. It was not the polite, distant greeting of a man meeting a stranger. It was the familiar, deeply respectful welcome of a business partner acknowledging an equal. The air in David's lungs seemed to simply evaporate. He took a stumbling step backward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He stared at Arthur, then stared at me, his brain completely unable to reconcile the reality unfolding in front of him. David had spent months trying to impress Arthur. He had spent tens of thousands of dollars of my stolen money trying to buy access to the inner circle that Arthur controlled. And here was the chairman of the board ignoring David entirely, greeting his discarded, supposedly delusional wife like she was the guest of honor. What David did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that 48 hours ago I had sat in a private, heavily guarded conference room with my attorney Thomas and Arthur Kensington himself. We had laid out the entire forensic audit on a mahogany table. We had shown Arthur the forged loan documents, the wire transfers, and the irrefutable proof that David had committed massive federal insider trading by purchasing shares in the startup Victoria was acquiring. We had shown Arthur that I, the discarded wife, was the sole legal owner of the shell company holding those shares, giving me the absolute power to block the multi-million-dollar merger. Arthur had been furious. He was a man who protected his company above all else. The realization that a low-level con artist had infiltrated his executive suite, compromised a major acquisition, and endangered the entire conglomerate with severe federal SEC violations had enraged him. Arthur had personally insisted that I attend the gala tonight. He wanted to spring the trap in public. He wanted to watch the fraud collapse in front of the entire board of directors. Arthur turned slightly, finally acknowledging David's existence. He looked at my husband with an expression so intensely cold and devoid of human warmth that it made the freezing Chicago air feel like a summer breeze. "David," Arthur said, his voice dropping the jovial tone and replacing it with a sharp corporate steel. "I see you have finally found the time to greet our most crucial and highly anticipated guest." David tried to speak. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. "Sir," he stammered, his voice sounding thin and weak. "Arthur, there has to be some kind of massive misunderstanding. This woman she is just a former employee. She is not supposed to be here. She is mentally unstable." Arthur raised a single commanding eyebrow. "A former employee. Mentally unstable. Is that what you have been telling people, David?" "Yes, sir," David pleaded, desperation making his voice crack. "She is stalking me. I was just about to have security remove her from the building before she causes a scene and ruins the celebration." Arthur let out a low, dangerous chuckle. He turned to me, his eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. "Well, Sarah, it appears your husband has a rather vivid imagination. Perhaps it is time we corrected the narrative." David actually recoiled, taking another full step backward. His eyes darted wildly between me and the chairman of the board. The specific words hit him like a physical barrage. "Your husband." Arthur knew. Arthur knew everything. The realization crashed into David's mind with devastating force. He was not standing in front of a crazy ex-wife and a confused boss. He was standing between a corporate executioner and the woman holding the axe. David looked down at the black leather folio clutched tightly in my hands. For the first time all night, he finally understood that the papers inside were not divorce documents waiting for a signature. They were the financial death warrants he had signed himself. I stepped forward, closing the distance David had created, moving directly into his personal space. I did not need to shout. I did not need to raise my voice. I simply looked into the terrified, defeated eyes of the man who had tried to bury me in debt, and I delivered the final devastating reality check. "You told me to sign the papers quietly and walk away, David," I whispered softly. "But unfortunately for you, I own the startup your new fiancé is trying to buy, and I am not going anywhere." David stood perfectly still in the center of the grand ballroom, the joyful music and the laughter of the billionaires swirling around him, completely isolated in the terrifying knowledge that his perfect fraudulent life was about to be burned to ashes. The clinking of silver spoons against crystal goblets echoed through the massive ballroom, cutting through the low, steady hum of hundreds of wealthy conversations. The string orchestra gracefully faded their joyful symphony into silence as the room's attention shifted toward the front. On a raised mahogany stage framed by cascading white floral arrangements and towering ice sculptures stood Victoria. She looked every inch the billionaire tech heiress draped in a stunning emerald silk evening gown, her posture exuding absolute control and untouchable success. Beside her stood my husband David. He was attempting to project the image of a confident self-made titan of industry, but from my vantage point near the grand entrance, I could see the rigid stiffness in his spine and the nervous, frantic sheen of sweat gathering at his temples. He knew I was in the building. He knew William Kensington, the chairman of the board, had welcomed me. But David was a man who survived on arrogance, and he still believed he could somehow bluff his way through the next hour. Victoria leaned into the sleek microphone stand, offering a radiant practice smile to the massive crowd of venture capitalists, board members, and elite socialites. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Her voice echoed smooth and perfectly modulated. "This evening marks a monumental milestone not just for our company, but for me personally. Tonight we celebrate the future." She reached out and took David's hand, lifting it up for the room to see. The 2-carat vintage cushion-cut diamond flashed brilliantly under the massive chandeliers. When I took over this conglomerate, I was told it would be lonely at the top. I was told that finding a true partner, someone who understood the brutal pressures of this industry, someone who did not need my wealth or my status, would be nearly impossible. The crowd let out a soft, sympathetic murmur. Victoria gazed adoringly at the man who had secretly drained my checking account and forced me to sleep in a freezing car just to afford his luxury lease payments. And then I met David. She continued, her voice swelling with genuine affection. A man of absolute integrity. A brilliant, independently wealthy entrepreneur who built his success entirely on his own merit. He is a man who values honesty above all else. His business acumen is matched only by his incredible character. In a few weeks, we will finalize a historic corporate merger that will redefine the tech landscape. But tonight, I am celebrating an even greater partnership. I am so incredibly proud to announce our engagement. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Photographers rushed the stage, snapping flashing pictures. David forced a wide, handsome smile, waving modestly to the crowd, playing the part of the humble genius to absolute perfection. His parents, sitting at a prime table near the stage, were beaming with greedy pride, clapping loudly for the son who was about to secure their financial future through a billionaire daughter-in-law. I did not clap. I stood perfectly still, letting the wave of applause wash over me. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool, smooth leather of my folio in my hand. It was time. I stepped out from the shadows of the grand archway and began to walk. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of an auditor walking into a hostile boardroom. My black stiletto heels struck the polished floor with rhythmic, undeniable precision. As I moved deeper into the crowd, the people nearest to me began to notice. Wealthy investors and socialites instinctively parted, stepping aside to create a narrow, clear path. They did not know who I was, but they recognized the sheer, unyielding authority radiating from my tailored charcoal suit and my uncompromising posture. The applause began to falter, tapering off unevenly, as more and more guests turned their attention away from the stage and toward the woman marching directly toward the spotlight. Victoria's smile wavered as she noticed the confusion rippling through her audience. David saw me, and whatever color was left in his face vanished entirely. He looked like a man strapped to the tracks watching a freight train barrel toward him. From the corners of the room, 3 massive men wearing dark suits and earpieces suddenly moved. The private security detail. They stepped quickly into the center aisle, forming a solid human wall between me and the stage. The lead guard raised a heavy hand, signaling me to stop immediately. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the guard ordered, his voice low and threatening, hand reaching for my shoulder. Before I could even register his movement, a sharp, commanding voice rang out from the front row. "Stand down, gentlemen." It was William Kensington. The chairman of the board stood up from his prime seat, smoothing the front of his tuxedo jacket. He looked at the security guards with absolute, unquestionable authority. "This woman is an invited guest of the board. Let her pass immediately." The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing up at Victoria on the stage for confirmation. But Victoria was too shocked to issue a counter-command. William nodded sharply, and the security wall instantly dissolved. The guards stepped back, lowering their hands and clearing my path to the wooden stairs. The silence in the massive ballroom was now absolute and suffocating. 300 people were holding their breath, sensing that the polished, perfect narrative of the evening had just violently derailed. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped directly onto the mahogany stage. David took a panicked, stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over a heavy microphone cable. He held his hands out in front of him, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, silently, begging me to stop. I walked past him without a single glance. I approached the second microphone stand positioned on the stage, the one reserved for the upcoming merger presentation. I pulled the microphone from its metal cradle. The slight feedback hummed through the massive speakers, making a few guests jump in their seats. I turned to face Victoria. The billionaire CEO looked completely lost. She stared at me, then at William Kensington, then at David, desperately trying to comprehend why a stranger had just hijacked her engagement party with the blessing of her own board chairman. "Victoria," I said. My voice echoed through the silent ballroom, clear, crisp, and completely devoid of fear. "We have not been formally introduced. My name is Sarah Myers. I am an accountant from the suburbs." Victoria frowned, her perfectly manicured hands tightening around her silk shawl. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of rising anger and profound confusion. "David, who is this person and why is she on my stage?" David tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, looking wildly around the room for an exit that did not exist. I did not let him recover. "Your fiancé is a man of many secrets." "Victoria." I continued pacing slowly across the stage, addressing both her and the hundreds of wealthy guests watching us. "You just stood in front of your esteemed colleagues and praised his integrity. You praised his independent wealth and his honest character. I am here tonight to provide some crucial financial corrections to that narrative." I opened my sleek black leather folio. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of certified appraisal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. I held them up for the entire room to see. "For instance, let us start with the foundation of this new partnership. The ring currently sitting on your left hand." Victoria instinctively covered her left hand with her right, her eyes widening in genuine alarm. "David told me he had this custom designed for me by a private jeweler in Europe," she said, her voice wavering, sounding less like a ruthless corporate titan and more like a terrified woman realizing she was standing on quicksand. "David tells a lot of highly creative stories," I replied smoothly, never breaking eye contact with her. "He also told you he was a self-made millionaire. He also told you he was completely single. But the undeniable truth is, David has been legally married to me for the past 5 years. I spent my entire 20s working 60-hour weeks to pay off his $80,000 student loans so he could afford to buy the tailored suits he wore to his job interviews at your company." A collective horrified gasp echoed through the massive ballroom. The investors and board members began whispering frantically to one another. David's parents, sitting just 15 feet away in the front row, looked like they were going to physically be sick. His mother covered her face with both hands, shrinking down into her chair as the guests around her began to stare in absolute disgust. I took a deliberate step closer to Victoria. My eyes locked onto the vintage diamond, reflecting the chandelier light. I am not here to fight you for him, Victoria. You can absolutely keep the lying bankrupt fraud. But you cannot keep that ring, because it does not belong to a European jeweler. It belongs to my late grandmother, Alice Montgomery. David stole it from our marital safe deposit box exactly 2 weeks ago because he had completely maxed out his credit cards, playing pretend in your wealthy world, and he could not afford to buy you a real engagement ring. That is a lie, Victoria whispered, her face completely drained of color. She turned to David, her eyes pleading for him to deny it, to tell her this was all just a crazy, elaborate fabrication. David, tell me she is lying right now. David opened his mouth, desperately trying to construct a defense out of thin air. Victoria, please, I told you about her. She is an obsessed former employee. She is mentally unstable. She is making all of this up to ruin my career because I rejected her. I did not raise my voice to argue. I simply extended the certified appraisal documents toward Victoria, letting the paperwork do the talking. You do not have to take my word for it, I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic, flailing lies with surgical precision. Take the ring off your finger right now. Look closely at the inside of the platinum band. It is engraved with the year 1952. Right next to the date you will find 2 faded gold initials, A and M, Alice Montgomery. The entire ballroom watched in absolute paralyzed silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like the air had turned to glass. Victoria looked down at her hand. Her fingers were trembling visibly. She slid the heavy 2-carat diamond off her finger and held it up to the bright light of the stage. She narrowed her eyes, squinting at the inner band, inspecting the metal, exactly as I had instructed. I watched the exact moment her entire world collapsed. Her elegant shoulders dropped heavily. The breath hitched violently in her throat, escaping as a sharp, painful gasp. She stared at the engraving, the undeniable physical proof of a breathtaking betrayal. The ring she thought represented a billionaire partnership, the ring she had just proudly displayed to 300 people, was actually the stolen heritage of the woman whose bank accounts were drained to fund her romantic dinners. Victoria slowly lowered her hand. She did not look at me. She turned her head and looked directly at David. The expression on her face was no longer confused or embarrassed. It was pure, highly concentrated corporate rage. It says 1952, Victoria whispered, her voice carrying through the microphone she still held in her other hand. It says A and M. David backed away from her, his hands raised in surrender, sweat pouring down his face. Victoria, please let me explain. I can explain everything. I just wanted to give you the world. I just wanted to be worthy of you. You are not worthy of an entry-level cubicle, I said, stepping up to the edge of the stage, my voice ringing with absolute finality. But stealing my family heirloom to fund your fake life is not the reason I'm standing on this stage tonight. I looked past David, past Victoria's horrified face, and locked eyes with William Kensington and the entire board of directors sitting in the front rows. I dropped the appraisal documents and pulled a much thicker, heavier stack of papers from my leather folio. I am here because my husband's habit of stealing did not stop with vintage jewelry, I announced, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. I am here because his financial crimes are about to cost your conglomerate hundreds of millions of dollars. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and incredibly heavy. 300 of the most powerful people in the city were staring at the stage, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal unfolding in real time in front of their eyes. David was visibly suffocating in the bright spotlight. I watched his chest heave rapidly beneath his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. He looked completely feral, like a trapped animal backed into a corner with absolutely no escape route. He pointed a trembling, frantic finger at me, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. She is lying, David stammered, his voice cracking violently over the microphone system, sounding high-pitched and desperate. Victoria Arthur, you have to listen to me. This woman is completely out of her mind. She forged that jewelry appraisal. She is just a disgruntled former employee who became obsessed with me. She is trying to ruin my reputation because I rejected her advances. Security needs to remove her right now. Please get her out of here. He turned wildly toward the private guard standing at the base of the mahogany stairs, silently pleading with them to intervene. But the massive men in the dark suits did not move a single muscle. Arthur Kensington, the chairman of the board, had given them their orders, and absolutely no one in this room was going to cross the ultimate authority. David looked back at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, begging terror. He wanted me to back down. He wanted the quiet, compliant accountant who always fixed his careless mistakes to magically return and save him from the fire he had started. But that naive woman had died the exact moment she found her personal belongings stuffed into black garbage bags on a freezing concrete driveway. I did not raise my voice to match his escalating panic. I did not need to shout to command the room. I calmly unclasped the sleek black leather folio I had carried through the sea of billionaires and venture capitalists. The soft sound of the metal snap echoed sharply across the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of certified financial documents Thomas and I had meticulously assembled over the past 72 hours. I turned my back on David, entirely dismissing his existence. He was no longer the threat in the room. He was just the collateral damage. I directed my attention to the front rows, locking my eyes with the distinguished men and women who controlled Victoria's massive tech conglomerate. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the ballroom speakers, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. My husband just called me a liar. He claims I am here to ruin his spotless reputation out of spite. But numbers do not lie. Certified bank statements do not hold petty grudges. And forensic audits do not invent federal crimes. A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the rows of powerful executives. They were people who understood the devastating, undeniable power of a paper trail. I held up the first set of documents, the thick pages bearing the official raised seals of national banks and state property registries. David did not just steal a family heirloom to buy his way into your exclusive world. I continued pacing slowly across the mahogany stage, commanding the space completely. He funded his entire fraudulent billionaire lifestyle by secretly taking out a $250,000 home equity line of credit against a small wooden cabin in northern Wisconsin. A cabin that belonged to my late mother, a property that was legally and entirely mine. He sat in our modest suburban home, logged into my personal email account, and forged my digital signature to secure the capital. I paused, letting the sheer depravity of the act sink into the minds of the wealthy audience. The guests exchanged horrified, disgusted glances. David's parents, sitting in the front row, looked physically ill. His mother was gripping the edge of her table so hard her knuckles were white, the arrogant pride completely erased from her face. But the board members remained perfectly still, their calculating eyes locked on the documents in my hands. But $250,000 does not last very long when you are buying luxury sports cars and elite country club memberships. I said, my tone flattening into a clinical professional rhythm. David knew he needed a massive guaranteed return on his investment before the stolen funds completely ran out. He needed a sure thing. And as a senior director sitting in Victoria's executive suite, he had access to the most lucrative guarantee possible. He had access to highly classified, unreleased corporate information. Victoria let out a sharp, ragged gasp that carried clearly across the stage. The color entirely vanished from her perfectly contoured face. She took a stumbling step away from David as the horrific reality of my words finally broke through her denial. David took $150,000 of the money he stole from me, I announced, making sure every single syllable rang out with crystal clarity, and he wired it to an anonymous holding company called Apex Data Ventures. That holding company then used the stolen capital to quietly purchase a massive block of shares in a rising cloud storage startup, a startup named Nexus Innovations. The entire ballroom seemed to collectively stop breathing. The name Nexus Innovations hit the crowd like a physical blow. Everyone in that room knew the name. It was the exact company Victoria was planning to acquire in a multi-million-dollar merger at the end of the month. It is textbook, undeniable insider trading, I declared, turning to stare directly into David's terrified, weeping eyes. He used his intimate knowledge of your upcoming corporate acquisition to buy equity in the target company. He intended to multiply his stolen money 10 times over the second your merger became public knowledge. He was going to use your company to make himself a millionaire, completely violating federal securities laws and endangering this entire corporate conglomerate in the process. David fell to his knees. The strength completely evaporated from his legs. He collapsed right there on the stage, his head dropping heavily into his hands as the undeniable truth of his crimes washed over the room. He was utterly destroyed. But I was not finished. The final nail in his legal coffin still needed to be driven home. I turned away from his pathetic, whimpering figure and faced Victoria. The untouchable billionaire CEO was shaking violently, her emerald silk gown trembling as she stared at the man she had just promised to marry. Her pristine corporate empire, her flawless reputation, and her entire professional future were suddenly standing on the terrifying edge of a federal investigation. "Victoria," I said gently, speaking directly to her, stripping away the public performance. David knew he could not put those illegal shares in his own name. Your compliance department would have flagged his background check immediately. He needed a clean, untraceable identity to serve as the managing member of his shell company. He needed someone completely disconnected from the tech industry. So in his infinite foolish arrogance, he used the exact same identity he had already successfully hijacked. I pulled the final, most devastating document from my leather folio. It was the certified Delaware incorporation record for Apex Data Ventures. I held it out toward her. He put the shell company in my name. I revealed the profound irony of his fatal mistake, bringing a cold, hard satisfaction to my chest. David made his discarded suburban wife the sole legal owner and managing member of Apex Data Ventures. He thought I would be too broken, too devastated by his sudden divorce filing to ever notice a holding company. He handed me a settlement offer this morning for a pathetic $5,000, completely convinced I would just blindly sign it and walk away crying into the night. Victoria stared at this paper in my hand, her eyes wide with absolute dawning horror. She understood corporate law just as well as I did. She knew exactly what that signature line meant for her legacy. Since the shell company is legally registered in my name, I announced, my voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of total victory, I legally own those shares. I control the equity in Nexus Innovations. And as a major shareholder of the target company, your board cannot legally execute this acquisition without my explicit signed consent. I lowered the document and looked at Victoria, delivering the final, crushing blow. And I am blocking the merger. The room erupted into total chaos. The venture capitalists began shouting over each other. The society elites gasped in shock, covering their mouths. Victoria physically swayed, bringing a trembling hand to her forehead, as if she might actually faint. The multi-million-dollar deal she had spent the entire year orchestrating was completely dead-killed by the very man she had invited into her bed. David let out a loud, wretched sob from the floor, begging anyone who would listen to forgive him. But the chaos was instantly silenced by a single booming voice from the front row. "That is quite enough." William Kensington, the chairman of the board, walked slowly and deliberately up the wooden stairs and stepped onto the mahogany stage. The grand ballroom fell deathly quiet once again. Arthur exuded an aura of total terrifying command. He did not look at David. He did not even look at Victoria. He walked directly over to the microphone stand I had been using and took the microphone from my hand. He gave me a single, deeply respectful nod, silently acknowledging the flawless execution of the trap we had set together. Then Arthur turned his attention to the wreckage weeping on the floor. "David," Arthur said. The name sounded like a filthy curse word falling from his lips. "You were invited into this company because we believed you possessed integrity. We gave you access to the highest levels of our corporate strategy. You repaid that immense trust by committing severe federal securities violations, orchestrating gross financial fraud, and putting this entire institution at risk of an SEC investigation. David looked up, his face stained with tears, his hands clasped together in a pathetic, desperate gesture of begging. Arthur, please, I can fix this. I can sign the shares back over. I can make this right. Please do not ruin my life over a mistake. You have absolutely no authority to fix anything, Arthur stated coldly, his voice echoing through the silent room like a judge delivering a final sentence. Effective immediately, your employment with this conglomerate is permanently terminated. You are to be escorted from these premises by security. You will not return to your office. You will not have access to your corporate accounts. Our legal team will be turning over all evidence of your insider trading and wire fraud directly to federal authorities first thing on Monday morning. David let out a long, agonizing wail. He collapsed entirely against the stage floor, curling into a tight ball as the reality of his absolute destruction finally took hold. He was going to prison. He was going to lose everything. But Arthur was not finished. The chairman of the board turned his formidable, terrifying gaze toward Victoria. The CEO shrank back, her immense wealth and status, providing absolutely zero protection from the wrath of her own chairman. She had brought a criminal into their most secure inner circles. She had let her personal arrogance blind her to the massive liability sleeping right next to her. Victoria Arthur said, his tone completely devoid of any former warmth or professional respect. The board of directors entrusted you to lead this company with exceptional judgment. You have spectacularly failed that mandate. Your inability to properly vet a senior executive, your reckless intermingling of personal and professional affairs, and your profound negligence in this matter have cost us a crucial acquisition and exposed us to federal scrutiny. Victoria opened her mouth to defend herself, hot tears spilling down her perfectly powdered cheeks. Arthur, I did not know. I swear to you I had no idea he was doing this behind my back. Ignorance is not a defense when you are sitting in the chief executive chair, Arthur fired back, his voice completely unforgiving. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all executive duties pending a full independent board investigation into your gross negligence. You will hand over your security credentials tonight. Victoria gasped, covering her face as a quiet sob racked her shoulders. The brilliant, untouchable tech heiress had lost her company, her reputation and her flawless future all in the span of 15 minutes. Arthur signaled the security guards waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The three massive men marched onto the stage. Two of them grabbed David by the arms, hauling his limp, sobbing body up from the mahogany floor. The third guard stepped gently but firmly next to Victoria, silently indicating that it was time for her to leave the ballroom. I stood on the stage watching the security detail drag my cheating, fraudulent husband out of the room. He did not look like a billionaire tech genius anymore. He looked like a pathetic, broken man who had finally met the consequences of his own arrogance. He had tried to discard me in the freezing cold. He had tried to steal my mother's legacy to build his fake empire. Now he had absolutely nothing. I looked down at the black leather folio in my hands. The years of quiet sacrifice, the years of shrinking myself to fit into his life, the years of believing I was only valuable as a background character, they were all completely gone. I had walked into the lion's den and I had burned it to the ground. I turned and walked calmly off the stage, my head held high, leaving the ruins of their elite world behind me. The absolute silence that had suffocated the grand ballroom shattered into a million jagged pieces of chaos. The refined, polite composure of the tech billionaires and venture capitalists completely evaporated, replaced by a rising tide of shocked gasps, furious whispers, and urgent phone calls being made to legal teams. The air, which just minutes ago had smelled of expensive orchids and imported champagne, now felt thick with the undeniable stench of ruined reputations. Victoria did not scream. She did not throw a theatrical tantrum or dissolve into a puddle of weeping heartbreak. She was a corporate titan who had just realized she had invited a highly infectious parasite into her inner circle. She stepped forward, her emerald silk gown rustling against the polished mahogany stage, and delivered a slap so sharp, so viciously powerful, that the sound cracked through the massive ballroom like a fired pistol. David recoiled, crying out as the force of the blow snapped his head strictly to the side. He stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, his chest heaving with desperate, pathetic sobs. He opened his mouth, trying to string together another sequence of pathetic lies. But Victoria silenced him with a look of such absolute freezing disgust that it made my own spine tingle. She reached down, picked up the vintage diamond ring she had dropped onto the stage floor, and hurled it directly at his chest. The heavy platinum band bounced off his custom-tailored tuxedo and clattered away into the darkness of the stage wings. "Do not ever speak to me again," Victoria commanded, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, controlled fury. "You will speak only to federal investigators and my personal litigation team." She turned on her heel, descending the wooden stairs with her security detail forming a tight protective wedge around her, completely abandoning the man she had almost married. I stood near the edge of the stage, watching the security guards hoist David by his armpits. He was entirely limp, his highly expensive Italian leather shoes dragging pathetically against the floorboards as they hauled him toward the rear exits. He did not look like an independent, wealthy tech entrepreneur anymore. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a small, greedy man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. As I turned to make my own exit, my eyes swept across the crowd and locked onto the far corner of the room. Standing rigidly against the oak-paneled wall was Emily. The vibrant green sequined dress she wore suddenly looked ridiculous, completely out of place on a woman whose entire world was collapsing in real time. Her face was chalk white, drained of all the arrogant, smug superiority she had carried just an hour ago in the foyer. She was physically trembling, her hands clutching her evening bag like a life preserver. Emily had thought she was so incredibly clever when she helped her brother pack my life into garbage bags. She had thought she was part of the winning team riding the coattails of David's fraudulent success into a lifetime of country club dinners and elite connections. But as she stood there watching her brother being dragged out by security, the horrifying reality of the situation washed over her. She knew David had used my stolen money to fund his life. She was complicit in the cover-up. And now she was realizing that the golden goose she had worshipped was heading straight for a federal prison cell. I watched as Emily turned to her husband, grabbing his sleeve desperately, looking for comfort or an escape route. But her husband did not pull her close. He looked at the stage, looked at the furious corporate executives surrounding them, and then looked down at his wife with an expression of profound, horrifying realization. He physically peeled her fingers off his jacket, took a large step away from her, and walked out of the ballroom alone. The toxic liability of the Myers family had just become public knowledge, and he was already cutting his losses. I did not offer Emily a single word. I did not need to. Her punishment had already begun, and it was going to last for the rest of her life. I walked out through the main doors of the country club, leaving the shouting, scrambling elite society far behind me. The valet brought my 10-year-old Honda Civic to the front curb. He opened the door with a newfound silent respect. I tipped him generously, slid into the driver's seat, and drove back out through the massive wrought iron gates. The freezing Chicago night air whipped through the cracked window, but I had never felt warmer. The justice that followed over the next 3 months was not swift, but it was absolutely relentless. When you steal a few $100s from a cash register, you might get a quiet plea deal. But when you use a forged real estate loan to illegally purchase equity in a startup immediately prior to a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition, you trigger the undivided, furious attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. David was formally indicted on multiple federal charges. The list of his crimes read like a masterclass in financial self-destruction. Wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and severe violations of federal insider trading laws. The day the authorities raided his luxury apartment, it made the evening news. I watched from the comfort of my living room as agents in heavy windbreakers carried boxes of hard drives and financial records out of his building. There was no high-priced family law attorney who could save him from the federal government. He was denied bail due to the sheer magnitude of the financial flight risk, and he was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting a trial that would inevitably result in a lengthy prison sentence. His parents, who had spent years bragging to their suburban neighbors about their incredibly successful genius son, were forced to put their house on the market to help pay for his mounting criminal defense fees. They had willingly turned a blind eye to my suffering because my replacement offered them a taste of luxury. Now they were drowning in the absolute humiliation of raising a convicted fraud. Emily's downfall was quieter but no less devastating. Her husband, a man whose entire career in corporate sales depended on a flawless public reputation, filed for divorce 3 weeks after the country club disaster. He cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone in their social circle knew the truth. He could not be legally or socially tied to a family currently being investigated for federal financial crimes. Emily lost the beautiful house she loved to flaunt. She lost the country club membership she had constantly rubbed in my face. The woman who had proudly texted me a photograph of my belongings sitting in garbage bags on a freezing driveway was forced to move her own belongings into a tiny rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. The universe has a remarkably poetic way of balancing its scales. As for me, the resolution of the massive corporate merger required absolute meticulous precision. Because David had arrogantly registered Apex Data Ventures completely in my name, I was the sole legal owner of the equity stake in Nexus Innovations. Victoria's conglomerate still desperately wanted to acquire the startup. The technology was too valuable for them to abandon simply because one of their former directors was a criminal. But Arthur Kensington, the chairman of the board, knew they could not proceed without my signature. Thomas and I sat in Arthur's corner office a week after the gala. We did not demand anything unreasonable, but we absolutely did not accept a penny less than what those shares were mathematically worth upon acquisition. The board of directors, eager to wash their hands of the scandal and push the merger through, agreed to a massive expedited buyout of my shell company's equity. I forced the sale of the shares at an incredible premium. The final wire transfer hit my newly established, heavily secured private banking account on a Tuesday afternoon. The first thing I did was pay off the $250,000 loan that David had fraudulently attached to my mother's cabin. I contacted the National Bank, cleared the entire balance in one single payment, and demanded the formal release of the lien. A week later, the certified deed arrived in the mail completely free and clear. I framed it and hung it directly over my desk. The modest, weathered sanctuary in the Wisconsin pines, the only piece of my mother I had left, was permanently and unconditionally safe. Nobody would ever be able to touch it again. After the loan was cleared, after the taxes were properly filed and set aside, and after Thomas was generously paid for his brilliant legal warfare, I walked away with over $2 million in pure, unencumbered profit. I did not buy a luxury sports car. I did not buy an elite country club membership to impress people who did not care about me. That money was not a status symbol. It was a fortress. It was the ultimate impenetrable wall between me and anyone who ever thought they could use me as a stepping stone again. I quit my job at the suffocating corporate accounting firm. The late nights and the ungrateful partners no longer held any power over my schedule. I took a portion of my new capital and opened my own independent financial consulting firm. I rented a beautiful sunlit office in a historic brick building downtown just 2 blocks away from Thomas. I furnished it with heavy oak desks, comfortable chairs, and massive green plants that made the space feel incredibly alive. I specialized in forensic accounting and financial advocacy for individuals navigating high-conflict divorces. I spent my days helping men and women untangle the complex, deceptive financial webs woven by spouses who thought they could hide their assets in the dark. I became the exact person I had desperately needed on that freezing February night. Every time I helped a client discover a hidden bank account, every time I helped someone secure their rightful independence, I felt another piece of my own trauma permanently heal. My life now is remarkably quiet and incredibly beautiful. I wake up every morning in a bright, spacious condominium overlooking the lake. I drink my coffee slowly without rushing to pack a lunch for a husband who does not appreciate me. I spend my weekends driving up to the Wisconsin cabin, breathing in the scent of cedar and pine, sitting on the wooden dock with a good book and absolutely nowhere else to be. I am completely, utterly free from the crushing weight of carrying an ungrateful parasitic family. I used to believe that love required endless accommodation. I believed that if I just worked a little harder, sacrificed a little more, and kept making myself smaller and smaller eventually, David and his family would realize my value. I thought my quiet loyalty would eventually be rewarded with basic respect. I was completely wrong. When you give your entire life to people who view you as an appliance, they do not suddenly wake up and decide to treat you like a human being. They simply continue to use you until you are completely broken, and then they complain about the inconvenience of having to throw you away. They took my savings, they took my home, and they tried to take my mother's memory. But in their foolish, blind arrogance, they handed me the exact tools I needed to build a titanium empire. They thought they were burying a compliant, weak accountant. They did not realize they were planting a seed that would grow into an absolute force of nature. If you are watching this, understand one thing: sacrifice is only beautiful when it is for someone who values it. Never let anyone convince you to shrink yourself to fit their narrative. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's survival. Have you ever discovered a betrayal that forced you to rewrite your entire life? Share your story. In the comments, I read every single one. And if this story reminded you of your own strength, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Until next time, remember, you write your own ending.